Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we continue tonight's journey through the quiet halls of justice, take a moment to notice the sounds around you right now. Perhaps it's the gentle hum of electricity, the distant murmur of traffic, or simply the rhythm of your own breathing. Let these sounds anchor you as we drift deeper into the methodical world of police documentation. The morning shift brought its own rhythm to the records division, different from the contemplative silence that Sarah had experienced during her nighttime visits. Detective Mark Williams arrived at 7:30 sharp, the way he had every weekday for the past 12 years, carrying his coffee in the same ceramic mug and settling into his desk with the practiced efficiency of someone who had found perfect harmony between routine and purpose. Williams worked in what the department called active documentation, the division responsible for transforming fresh incidents into the standardized reports that would eventually join the thousands of files resting in the basement archives. It was meticulous work that required a particular temperament, an ability to find meaning and precision, and satisfaction in the careful translation of human chaos into ordered prose. The first report on his desk dealt with a residential alarm that had been triggered at 3:47 in the morning on Maple Street. Officer Patricia Kim had responded to the call, arriving to find the Hendricks family standing on their front lawn in pajamas and robes, watching as she examined their home for signs of forced entry. The alarm system had been installed only 2 weeks earlier, following a series of break-ins in the neighborhood, and the family had not yet grown accustomed to its sensitivity. Officer Kim's preliminary report noted that the alarm had been triggered by the family cat, which had knocked over a floor lamp in the living room while chasing something that had moved in the shadows near the window. The investigation had taken 45 minutes, not because of any complexity in determining the cause of the alarm, but because Officer Kim had taken the time to help the family understand how to adjust their new security system to prevent similar incidents in the future. Williams read through Officer Kim's handwritten notes, appreciating the care she had taken to document not just the facts of the incident, but also the context that made those facts meaningful. The Hendricks family had been genuinely frightened by the alarm, particularly Mrs. Hendricks, who had assumed that their worst fears about neighborhood crime had been realized. Officer Kim had spent considerable time reassuring them that their security system was working exactly as designed, and that false alarms were a normal part of learning to live with enhanced home protection. The report included detailed information about the alarm system itself, the specific sensors that had been triggered, and the sequence of events that had led to the emergency response. Officer Kim had also documented her recommendations for adjusting the sensitivity settings, her explanation of how different types of motion could trigger different responses from the system, and her suggestion that the family practice their emergency procedures so that future alarms, whether real or false, would be less traumatic. Williams began the process of transforming Officer Kim's detailed field notes into the standardized format that would allow the incident to be properly cataloged and cross-referenced with other neighborhood security issues. This work required a particular kind of attention to detail, ensuring that every relevant piece of information was captured while maintaining the clear, professional language that characterized official police documentation. The Hendricks alarm became Incident Report 20243-847, filed under Residential Security, False Alarm, with cross-references to neighborhood watch activities and home security education. Williams added a note recommending that the community liaison officer follow up with the Hendricks family in 2 weeks to ensure that they had successfully adjusted their system and to offer additional resources for home security planning. The next report dealt with a traffic accident at the intersection of 5th Street and Commercial Avenue, where a delivery truck had collided with a sedan during the morning rush hour. Officer Rodriguez had responded to the scene, managing both the immediate safety concerns and the detailed documentation necessary for insurance claims and potential legal proceedings. The accident had occurred when the delivery truck, making a left turn against a yellow light, had been struck by the sedan, whose driver had been attempting to clear the intersection before the light changed to red. Neither driver had been seriously injured, but both vehicles had sustained significant damage, and the intersection had been blocked for nearly an hour while emergency crews worked to clear the scene. Officer Rodriguez's report read like a technical manual, describing the exact positions of the vehicles before and after impact, the weather conditions at the time of the accident, the visibility factors that might have affected each driver's ability to assess the situation accurately. He had taken measurements of skid marks, photographed the damage to both vehicles from multiple angles, and interviewed 3 witnesses who had observed the collision from different vantage points. Williams found something deeply satisfying about this kind of comprehensive documentation. Officer Rodriguez had created a complete record that would allow anyone reading the report months or years later to understand exactly what had happened at that intersection on that particular morning. The report included diagrams showing the trajectory of each vehicle, the timing of the traffic signals, and the various factors that had contributed to the collision. The sedan's driver, Margaret Foster, had been running late for an important meeting at work and had misjudged the amount of time she needed to clear the intersection safely. The delivery truck's driver, James Morton, had been dealing with an unusually heavy load that had affected his vehicle's acceleration and braking capabilities. Neither driver had been negligent in any legal sense, but both had made small errors in judgment that had combined to create the accident. Officer Rodriguez had handled the situation with patience and professionalism, helping both drivers understand their insurance obligations and ensuring that each had the information necessary to file accurate claims. He had also taken the time to discuss the intersection with both drivers, noting that the timing of the traffic lights created challenges during peak traffic hours and that similar accidents had occurred there in the past. Williams typed Officer Rodriguez's findings into Incident Report 2024388, categorizing it under traffic accidents, non-injury, and adding cross-references to intersection, safety analysis, and insurance documentation. He made a note recommending that the Traffic Engineering Department review the signal timing at 5th and Commercial, based on the pattern of similar incidents that had been documented over the past year. The third report on Williams's desk dealt with a completely different type of incident, one that required careful attention to both legal requirements and human sensitivity. Officer Martinez had been called to Riverside Elementary School, where a teacher had reported concerns about possible child abuse, based on injuries she had observed on 8-year-old Timothy Brennan. Officer Martinez's report documented her careful investigation of the situation, beginning with her interview with Timothy's teacher, Mrs. Anderson, who had noticed bruising on the child's arms and what appeared to be finger marks on his shoulders. Mrs. Anderson had followed proper protocol by reporting her concerns to the school principal, who had contacted Child Protective Services and requested police involvement. The investigation had required Officer Martinez to balance multiple competing concerns: the need to protect Timothy from potential harm, the importance of not traumatizing the child with invasive questioning, the legal requirements for documenting suspected abuse, and the necessity of treating Timothy's parents fairly until facts could be established. Officer Martinez had approached each aspect of the investigation with careful attention to both professional standards and human dignity. Her interview with Timothy had been conducted in the presence of a trained social worker, using techniques specifically designed for questioning young children about sensitive topics. Timothy had explained that the bruises came from playing with his older brother David, who was 12 and sometimes played too roughly during their backyard games. The finger marks on his shoulders had come from his father helping him learn to ride his bicycle, gripping him firmly to prevent falls while Timothy gained confidence with balance and steering. Officer Martinez had visited the Brennan home that afternoon, observing the family dynamics and interviewing both parents about their interaction with Timothy. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan had been cooperative and concerned, providing detailed explanations for Timothy's injuries and demonstrating the bicycle training technique that had caused the shoulder marks. They had also shown Officer Martinez the backyard area where Timothy and David played, pointing out the climbing structure and sandbox that could account for the various scrapes and bruises that were normal for an active 8-year-old. The social worker who had accompanied Officer Martinez had conducted her own assessment of the family situation, looking for signs of stress, dysfunction, or other factors that might contribute to child abuse. Her report, which was included in Officer Martinez's file, had found no evidence of neglect or maltreatment, but had recommended follow-up services to help the Brennan family understand how normal childhood activities could sometimes create marks that might be misinterpreted by well-meaning observers. Williams recognized the complexity of cases like this one, where the child protection system had to balance vigilance against abuse with respect for normal family life. Officer Martinez had handled the investigation with sensitivity and thoroughness, ensuring that Timothy's safety was protected while also treating his parents with fairness and respect. Her report would become part of a confidential file that could be referenced if future concerns arose, but which also documented that this particular incident had been thoroughly investigated and resolved. Incident Report 20243-849 was filed under Child Welfare Investigation, Unfounded, with cross-references to school reporting protocols and family services consultation. Williams added a note commending Mrs. Anderson for her appropriate concern for Timothy's welfare and Officer Martinez for her professional handling of a sensitive situation. The fourth report dealt with what initially appeared to be a simple case of trespassing but had evolved into something more complex. Officer Thompson had been called to the abandoned Riverside manufacturing building, where security guards had discovered evidence that someone had been sleeping in one of the former office spaces on the second floor. The building had been empty for 3 years, ever since the manufacturing company had relocated to a facility outside the city limits. The property was owned by a development company that planned to convert it into condominiums, but construction had been delayed by financing issues and zoning complications. In the meantime, the building had become a target for vandalism and unauthorized use by people seeking shelter from the elements. Officer Thompson's investigation had revealed that the trespasser was Harold Vance, a 54-year-old veteran who had been living in the building for several weeks after losing his apartment due to unpaid rent. Harold had set up a neat, organized living space in one of the offices, using cardboard and salvaged materials to create privacy and insulation. He had been careful not to damage the building and had even been cleaning up trash left by other unauthorized visitors. The case had presented Officer Thompson with a dilemma that went beyond simple law enforcement. Harold was clearly trespassing on private property, but he was also a homeless veteran who had been making efforts to find stable housing and employment. His temporary residence in the abandoned building was technically illegal, but it was causing no harm to anyone and was providing him with the basic shelter he needed while working to improve his situation. Officer Thompson had contacted the building's owner, explaining Harold's circumstances and asking whether they might be willing to work out some temporary arrangement that would allow him to remain until he could find proper housing. The development company had initially been reluctant, citing liability concerns and insurance issues, but Officer Thompson had persisted in his efforts to find a solution that would address everyone's legitimate concerns. The resolution had come through the involvement of the Veterans Administration and a local homeless services organization. Harold had been connected with emergency housing assistance and job placement services, while the development company had agreed not to press charges in exchange for Harold's agreement to vacate the building and accept social services support. Officer Thompson's report documented not only the legal aspects of the trespassing case, but also the collaborative problem-solving process that had led to a solution benefiting everyone involved. Harold had found stable housing and employment assistance. The property owner had regained full control of their building, and the community had avoided the costs and complications of prosecuting a homeless veteran for trying to survive. Williams typed this case as Incident Report 2024-3850, filing it under trespassing resolved through social services, with cross-references to Veterans Affairs Coordination and Homeless Services Outreach. He added a commendation for Officer Thompson's creative approach to a situation that could have been handled in a much more punitive manner. The fifth report on Williams's desk dealt with a domestic disturbance call that had required careful assessment of family dynamics and safety concerns. Officer Davis had responded to a 911 call from neighbors who had heard shouting and what sounded like objects being thrown in the apartment next door. Officer Davis had arrived to find a family in crisis, but not the kind of dangerous domestic violence situation that such calls often involved. Roberto and Maria Gutierrez were arguing about their 17-year-old son, Carlos, who had been arrested for underage drinking the previous weekend and was facing consequences that threatened his college scholarship opportunities. Argument had escalated because Roberto believed that Carlos should face the full legal consequences of his actions, including losing his scholarship if necessary, while Maria felt that they should do everything possible to help Carlos avoid penalties that could permanently affect his future. The dispute had become heated because both parents loved their son and wanted what was best for him, but they disagreed fundamentally about what that meant. Officer Davis had separated the parents and interviewed each of them individually before speaking with Carlos about his own perspective on the situation. Carlos had been genuinely remorseful about his drinking incident and was terrified about the possibility of losing his scholarship, which represented his family's hope for economic advancement through education. The report documented Officer Davis's patient work with the family to help them find common ground in their shared concern for Carlos's future. She had provided information about legal options for first-time offenders, including community service programs and counseling alternatives that might satisfy legal requirements while minimizing long-term consequences for college opportunities. Officer Davis had also connected the family with counseling services that specialized in helping families navigate the challenges of raising teenagers in environments where peer pressure and social expectations sometimes conflicted with family values and legal requirements. Her report noted that the family had agreed to work together on developing clear expectations and consequences for Carlos's future behavior. Williams filed this case as Incident Report 2024-3851, categorizing it under domestic disturbance family mediation, with cross-references to youth services coordination and educational support programs. He added a note recognizing Officer Davis's skill in helping a family find constructive solutions to a crisis that could have resulted in long-term damage to their relationships and their son's future. Each of these reports represented hours of careful police work, but the writing process required Williams to distill complex human situations into clear, professional documentation that would serve multiple purposes. The reports needed to satisfy legal requirements for evidence and procedure, provide accurate information for statistical analysis and policy development, and create permanent records that could be referenced months or years later if related issues arose. Williams took pride in this work, Understanding that his role in transforming field reports into official documentation was crucial to the proper functioning of the police department and the justice system. Every detail that he recorded accurately, every cross-reference that he created thoughtfully, every recommendation that he noted carefully, contributed to the department's ability to serve the community effectively. The morning continued with additional reports, requiring the same careful attention to detail and context. A shoplifting case at Morrison's department store had revealed that the suspect was a teenager trying to steal a dress for her school's formal dance because her family could not afford to buy one. Officer Kim had worked with the store manager and the local charity to find a solution that addressed both the legal violation and the underlying need that had motivated it. A noise complaint from the downtown district had led to the discovery of a street musician whose performances were attracting crowds that blocked sidewalk traffic. Officer Rodriguez had worked with city licensing officials to help the musician understand permit requirements and find appropriate locations where his performances could continue without creating public safety concerns. Report of suspicious activity in Riverside Park had turned out to involve a group of senior citizens who were practicing Tai Chi exercises early in the morning before the park became crowded with joggers and dog walkers. Officer Martinez had taken the time to learn about their exercise routine and had helped them identify the best times and locations for their activities to avoid conflicts with other park users. Each case required Williams to find the precise language that would capture both the facts of the incident and the human context that made those facts meaningful. This was work that demanded both technical accuracy and creative sensitivity. The ability to transform the messy complexity of real-life situations into clear, professional documentation that would serve the needs of multiple audiences. Williams understood that these reports would be read by supervisors evaluating officer performance, by attorneys preparing legal cases, by researchers studying crime patterns, by community leaders seeking to understand public safety issues, and by future officers looking for guidance in handling similar situations. Each report needed to provide accurate information for all of these purposes, while maintaining the professional tone and technical precision that characterized quality police documentation. The afternoon brought a different rhythm to the work, as Williams shifted his attention to older cases that required follow-up documentation or supplementary reports. A burglary case from the previous month needed additional information about recovered property that had been identified through pawn shop monitoring. A traffic accident from 6 weeks earlier required updated medical information about injuries that had proven more serious than initially apparent. These follow-up reports required Williams to coordinate with multiple agencies and departments, gathering information from hospitals, insurance companies, social service organizations, and other police units. The work demanded patience and persistence, as information often came in fragments that needed to be assembled into coherent updates to existing case files. A domestic violence case required coordination with the district attorney's office, which was preparing for trial and needed specific details about the responding officers, observations, and the evidence that had been collected at the scene. Williams worked with the officers involved to ensure that their testimony would be consistent with their original reports, while providing the additional detail that legal proceedings often required. A missing person case needed updating because the subject had been located safe in another state, living with relatives who had not been aware that anyone was looking for her. The update required coordination with law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions and with family members who needed to be notified about the resolution of their concerns. Throughout the afternoon, Williams maintained the same careful attention to detail that characterized all of his documentation work. Each supplementary report, each update, each coordination effort was handled with the understanding that accuracy and completeness were essential to the proper functioning of the justice system and the protection of everyone involved in these cases. The work required a particular temperament, an ability to find satisfaction in precision and meaning in the careful preservation of information. Williams had discovered over his 12 years in active documentation that this work suited him perfectly, providing the intellectual challenge of complex problem solving, combined with the practical satisfaction of contributing directly to public safety and justice. As the day shift wound down, Williams completed his documentation of the morning's incidents and prepared the files for routing to appropriate departments and agencies. Each report would follow its own path through the system, some moving quickly to resolution and filing, others requiring weeks or months of additional investigation and documentation. The reports he had processed that day would eventually join the thousands of files resting in the basement archives, becoming part of the vast catalog of human experience that the police department accumulated in its daily work. Each case represented someone's crisis, someone's problem, someone's intersection with the formal structures of law and order that made community life possible. Williams gathered his materials and prepared to leave for the day, knowing that tomorrow would bring another set of incidents requiring the same careful attention to detail and context. The work never truly ended, but it followed its own rhythm of documentation and preservation, creating a permanent record of the community's ongoing effort to maintain safety, order, and justice. The evening shift would bring different challenges and different cases, but the same fundamental commitment to accuracy and completeness that characterized all quality police documentation. Officers would respond to new incidents. Field supervisors would review reports for accuracy and completeness. And the careful work of transforming human chaos into ordered prose would continue through the night. In the basement archives, Detective Sarah Chun would return to her exploration of older cases, finding wisdom and insight in the documentation created by officers like Williams, who understood that their work was not just about enforcing laws, but about preserving the detailed record of a community's ongoing struggle to live together peacefully and justly. The reports that Williams had processed that day joined the endless stream of documentation that flowed through the police department. Each one a small but significant contribution to the larger project of maintaining civilization through the careful application of law, procedure, and human understanding. In the precise language of incident reports, every tragedy became manageable, every chaos transformed into order, every human crisis reduced to elements that could be addressed through the patient application of professional skill and community resources. The basement archive extended far beyond what most people realized, stretching through corridors that seemed to multiply in the dim fluorescent light. Room after room of filing cabinets created a labyrinth of documented history, each section organized according to systems that had evolved over decades of careful curation. Detective Sarah Chun had discovered that the archives held not just active case files, but layers upon layers of records that painted a complete picture of the city's relationship with crime, justice, and human nature. In Section M, she found herself surrounded by what the archivists called the cold case collection, files that had been moved from active investigation to permanent storage, not because they had been solved, but because the trail of evidence had grown too faint to follow. These cases rested in their folders with a different kind of energy than the resolved files, carrying the weight of questions that might never find answers, mysteries that had settled into the quiet, acceptance of the unknowable. The first file she pulled from cabinet M47 dealt with the disappearance of Marcus Webb, a 43-year-old accountant who had vanished from his office building on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1992. Detective James Morrison, who had led the investigation, had documented every lead with meticulous care, creating a record that read like a meditation on the puzzle of human behavior and the limits of what investigation could reveal. Marcus Webb had left his office at Consolidated, financial services at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, telling his secretary that he was going to the bank and would return within an hour. Security cameras had captured him leaving the building, walking north on 5th Street toward the downtown banking district, but after that point, he had simply vanished from all available records. His car remained in the office parking garage, his wallet and keys left behind in his desk drawer, his personal effects undisturbed in the office that he had occupied for 8 years. Detective Morrison's investigation had revealed a man whose life appeared to be perfectly ordinary on the surface, but contained depths that became more mysterious the more closely they were examined. Marcus had been divorced for 3 years, maintaining an amicable relationship with his ex-wife Jennifer and their teenage daughter Amanda. His work performance had been solid but unremarkable. His financial situation stable but not exceptional. His social life quiet but not isolated. The file contained dozens of interviews that Detective Morrison had conducted with everyone who had known Marcus, creating a portrait of a man who had been well-liked but not intimately known by anyone. His colleagues described him as reliable and pleasant, but noted that he rarely shared personal information or participated in office social activities. His neighbors knew him as the quiet man who kept his yard neat and always returned their greetings but had never developed friendships with anyone on his street. Even his family relationships, while cordial, seemed to maintain a certain distance. Jennifer Webb had told Detective Morrison that their marriage had ended not because of any dramatic conflict, but because of what she described as Marcus's increasing withdrawal from emotional intimacy. He had been a good provider and a responsible father, but she had felt as though she was living with someone who was present in body, but increasingly absent in spirit. Amanda Webb, 17 at the time of her father's disappearance, had described a parent who loved her, but seemed to struggle with expressing that love in ways that felt natural or spontaneous. Marcus had attended her school events and helped with her homework, but their conversations had been limited to practical matters, schedules, and responsibilities. She had sensed that her father wanted to be closer to her, but didn't know how to bridge the gap that seemed to widen as she grew older. Detective Morrison had explored every conventional possibility for Marcus's disappearance. Financial records showed no unusual transactions, no hidden debts, no secret accounts that might suggest flight or foul play. Medical records revealed no history of mental illness, no prescriptions that might affect judgment or behavior, no recent diagnoses that might motivate desperate actions. Background checks found no criminal connections, no hidden relationships, no involvement in activities that might attract dangerous attention. The investigation had expanded to include searches of parks, rivers, and abandoned buildings throughout the metropolitan area. Flyers with Marcus's photograph had been distributed to homeless shelters, hospitals, and mental health facilities across 3 states. Missing person alerts had been broadcast through police networks and media outlets, generating dozens of reported sightings that had all proven to be cases of mistaken identity. Detective Morrison had followed up on every lead, no matter how tenuous or unlikely. A gas station attendant in Ohio thought he had seen Marcus buying coffee 6 months after the disappearance. A hotel clerk in Arizona reported checking in someone who resembled Marcus but had used a different name and paid in cash. A park ranger in Colorado had found camping equipment that matched items missing from Marcus's apartment, but DNA testing had been inconclusive. The file documented 3 years of intensive investigation, each lead carefully pursued and documented, each theory methodically tested and either confirmed or eliminated. Detective Morrison had consulted with psychologists about the possibility of sudden onset mental illness, with financial experts about hidden assets or debts, with private investigators experienced in missing person cases, with federal agents familiar with witness protection protocols. Yet after all this careful work, Marcus Webb remained as mysteriously absent as he had been on the day he failed to return from his supposed trip to the bank. The case had been transferred to the Cold Case Unit in 1995, where it rested among hundreds of other mysteries that had proven resistant to conventional investigative techniques. Sarah found something deeply moving about Detective Morrison's final report, which acknowledged the limits of what investigation could accomplish while maintaining respect for the human complexity that had created the mystery. He had written that some disappearances might simply represent the ultimate expression of human autonomy, the decision to step away from an existence that had become unbearable in ways that others might never understand. The next file dealt with a series of burglaries that had occurred in the West Side neighborhood during the summer of 1988. Crimes that had been notable not for their violence or their scope, but for their peculiar selectivity. The burglar, who had never been identified or apprehended, had broken into 7 homes over a period of 6 weeks, but had taken only books, leaving behind electronics, jewelry, cash, and other valuable items that would have been much easier to sell. Detective Linda Rodriguez had approached the case with the same methodical care that characterized all good investigative work, but the crimes had presented unique challenges that had required creative thinking about motive and method. The books that had been stolen were not particularly valuable in monetary terms, nor did they seem to represent any coherent collection or theme. Fiction and nonfiction, classics and contemporary works, hardcovers and paperbacks had all been taken without apparent discrimination. The homeowners who had been victimized had all reported the same eerie sensation of violation combined with bewilderment. Mrs. Patricia Chun had described coming home to find her back door unlocked and her bookshelf completely empty, but everything else in her house exactly as she had left it. Her television, stereo system, and jewelry had been untouched, but every book in her collection, from cookbooks to romance novels, had disappeared. Detective Rodriguez had mapped the locations of the burglaries, looking for patterns in the choice of targets that might reveal something about the perpetrator's methods or motivations. The homes had been scattered throughout the neighborhood with no obvious connection, though all had been single-family houses occupied by people who lived alone and maintained extensive personal libraries. Investigation had revealed that the burglar possessed considerable skill in gaining entry without detection, but used that skill in service of crimes that made no apparent economic sense. Breaking into homes required significant risk and effort, but the stolen books could have been obtained much more easily and safely from used bookstores, library sales, or garage sales throughout the city. Detective Rodriguez had consulted with criminal psychologists about possible explanations for this unusual pattern of theft. Some suggested that the burglar might have been motivated by a compulsive disorder that created an irresistible urge to collect books, regardless of their content or value. Others proposed that the crimes might have been committed by someone who was illiterate but desperate to appear educated, hoping that surrounding themselves with books might somehow transfer knowledge or social status. A more intriguing theory suggested that the burglar might have been searching for specific books but was unable to identify them without taking entire collections for later examination. This possibility led Detective Rodriguez to contact rare book dealers and collectors throughout the region, asking whether anyone had been seeking particular titles that might motivate such unusual crimes. The investigation had generated several leads that seemed promising but ultimately led nowhere. A graduate student at the local university had been questioned about research methods that might require access to multiple personal libraries, but his alibi had been solid and his character references impeccable. A book dealer who specialized in estate sales had been investigated after several witnesses reported seeing him in the neighborhood during the period when the burglaries occurred, but surveillance had revealed that he was conducting legitimate business with clients who were downsizing their collections. The most significant Breakthrough in the case had come from an unexpected source, Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, whose extensive mystery novel collection had been stolen in the fourth burglary, had contacted Detective Rodriguez 6 weeks after the crime to report that she had seen several of her books in the waiting room of a local medical clinic. The books had been identifiable because she had written her name in a distinctive script on the title page of each volume. Detective Rodriguez had visited the clinic and confirmed that the books in question had indeed belonged to Mrs. Morrison. The clinic's office manager explained that they regularly accepted donations of books and magazines for their waiting room, and that these particular volumes had been dropped off anonymously several weeks earlier by someone who had simply left them at the reception desk with a note saying they were donations. This discovery had led to intensive surveillance of the clinic and interviews with staff members who might have observed the person making the donation. Security cameras had been installed in the hopes of capturing the book thief if they attempted to donate additional stolen materials. But the burglaries had ceased entirely after Mrs. Morrison's discovery, as though the perpetrator had realized that their disposal method had been compromised. Detective Rodriguez had expanded her investigation to include other medical facilities, libraries, and community centers that accepted book donations, hoping to find additional stolen materials that might provide leads to the burglar's identity. Several locations had reported receiving anonymous donations during the period in question, but none of the donated books could be definitively connected to the reported thefts. The case had gradually moved from active investigation to periodic review as other priorities demanded Detective Rodriguez's attention. The burglaries had stopped, the stolen books had begun to circulate through the community donation system, and the peculiar crimes had settled into the category of solved in practical terms but unresolved in legal terms. Detective Rodriguez's final report had reflected on the possibility that the book burglaries represented a form of compulsive behavior that had been satisfied or redirected, rather than stopped through law enforcement action. She had noted that the ultimate distribution of the stolen books to medical facilities and community centers had created a kind of accidental public service, providing reading material for people who might not otherwise have access to extensive book collections. Sarah found herself intrigued by the philosophical questions that cases like this raised about the nature of crime and justice. The book burglar had clearly violated the law and invaded the privacy of multiple homeowners, but the ultimate result of the crimes had been to redistribute books from private collections to public spaces, where they served a broader community need. Detective Rodriguez had struggled with how to categorize crimes that caused harm through their commission but created benefit through their resolution. The third file that Sarah pulled from the cold case collection dealt with a hit-and-run accident that had occurred on a quiet residential street in October of 1994. The victim, 70-year-old Robert Kowalski, had been walking his dog in the early evening when he was struck by a vehicle that had fled the scene without stopping to render aid or report the accident. Detective Michael Davis had led the investigation, working with traffic reconstruction specialists to piece together the sequence of events that had led to Mr. Kowalski's death. The accident had occurred on Elm Street, a tree-lined residential road where the speed limit was 25 miles per hour and traffic was typically light. During the dinner hour when the collision had taken place, physical evidence at the scene had indicated that the striking vehicle had been a dark-colored sedan, probably manufactured in the late 1980s or early 1990s, with damage to the front bumper and possibly the headlight assembly. Paint chips recovered from Mr. Kowalski's clothing had been analyzed to determine the exact color and finish of the vehicle, providing information that could be used to identify the car if it was located. the investigation had been complicated by the fact that there had been no witnesses to the actual collision. Mr. Kowalski had been found by a neighbor who had heard his dog barking frantically and had come outside to investigate. By the time emergency services arrived, Mr. Kowalski was unconscious and unable to provide any information about what had happened. Detective Davis had conducted extensive canvassing of the neighborhood, interviewing residents who might have seen or heard anything unusual around the time of the accident. Several people had reported hearing what might have been a car backfiring or a tire blowout, sounds that could have been consistent with a vehicle striking a pedestrian. But no one had actually observed the collision or seen a damaged vehicle leaving the area. The investigation had expanded to include body shops and auto parts dealers throughout the metropolitan area, looking for evidence of recent repairs that might be consistent with a hit-and-run accident. Detective Davis had provided detailed specifications about the type of damage that the striking vehicle would have sustained, asking repair facilities to report any customers who brought in cars with matching damage during the weeks following the accident. This approach had generated several promising leads that had required careful investigation. A body shop on the south side of the city had reported repairing front-end damage on a sedan that matched the general description of the vehicle sought in the hit-and-run. But the damage had been caused by a collision with a deer on a rural highway, an incident that had been reported to the owner's insurance company and documented with photographs. A parts dealer had sold a replacement headlight assembly for a vehicle that matched the suspected make and model, but the purchaser had provided identification and contact information that had led to a legitimate repair of damage caused by vandalism in a shopping center parking lot. The vandalism had been reported to police and documented, with security camera footage that clearly showed the damage being inflicted by teenagers with baseball bats. Detective Davis had also investigated the possibility that the hit-and-run driver might have been someone from outside the immediate area who had been unfamiliar with the neighborhood's quiet residential character. He had contacted police departments in surrounding jurisdictions, asking whether they had any reports of suspicious vehicle damage or unusual behavior by drivers during the period following the accident. The investigation had revealed that Mr. Kowalski had been a beloved figure in his neighborhood, a retired teacher who had lived on Elm Street for more than 30 years and was known for his daily walks with his aging golden retriever, Buddy. Neighbors had described him as a gentle man who always had time for conversation and who had helped many of them with tasks like snow removal and minor home repairs. Fact that someone had struck this well-regarded community member and then fled without attempting to help had generated considerable anger and determination among neighborhood residents. Several people had organized their own informal investigations, looking for damaged vehicles and questioning anyone who seemed unfamiliar with the area. Detective Davis had worked to channel this community energy in productive directions while ensuring that well-meaning neighbors didn't interfere with official investigative procedures. The case had remained active for more than 2 years, with Detective Davis following up on every lead and pursuing every possible avenue for identifying the hit-and-run driver. He had worked with the state motor vehicle department to identify all registered vehicles that matched the suspected description, conducting follow-up investigations on dozens of cars that had been involved in accidents or reported stolen. During the relevant time period, the investigation had also included efforts to reconstruct Mr. Kowalski's activities during the day of the accident, looking for any connections that might explain why someone would specifically target him for violence. These efforts had revealed nothing unusual about his routine or relationships, reinforcing the conclusion that his death had been the result of a tragic accident rather than an intentional crime. Detective Davis's final report had acknowledged that despite exhaustive investigation. The identity of the hit-and-run driver remained unknown. The case had been transferred to the cold case unit with the understanding that new information or advances in investigative technology might eventually provide the breakthrough that had eluded the original investigation. Sarah noted that Detective Davis had included in his final report a reflection on the impact that Mr. Kowalski's death had had on his neighborhood community. The accident had prompted residents to organize a campaign for improved street lighting and traffic safety measures that had made Elm Street safer for all pedestrians. A memorial garden had been created in the small park where Mr. Kowalski had often walked Buddy, providing a gathering place for neighbors and a tribute to his memory. The fourth file dealt with a series of anonymous letters that had been sent to various community leaders during the spring of 1991. Messages that had contained detailed information about municipal corruption, but had never been traced to their source. Detective Susan Kim had investigated the letters as a potential criminal matter, since they had contained accusations that, if false, could have constituted defamation or harassment. The letters had been sent to the mayor, several city council members, the chief of police, and the editor of the local newspaper. Each letter had contained specific allegations about bid rigging in municipal contracts, improper relationships between city officials and construction companies, and violations of conflict of interest policies in the awarding of development permits. Detective Kim's investigation had been complicated by the fact that many of the allegations contained in the anonymous letters had proven to be accurate. Subsequent investigation by Internal Affairs and the District Attorney's Office had confirmed that several city contracts had indeed been awarded through processes that violated proper bidding procedures, and that some officials had financial relationships with contractors that created clear conflicts of interest. Accuracy of the allegations had raised questions about the letter writer's motivations and identity. Someone with access to detailed information about municipal operations had chosen to expose corruption through anonymous letters rather than through official channels that existed for reporting such problems. Detective Kim had worked to understand why someone with this level of inside knowledge would choose anonymity over the protection and potential rewards that might have come from official whistleblowing. The investigation had involved analysis of the letters themselves, looking for clues about the writer's identity that might be contained in the paper used, the printing method, the language patterns, or other forensic evidence. The letters had been typed on a standard typewriter using common office paper, with no distinctive characteristics that could be traced to specific equipment or sources. Detective Kim had interviewed dozens of current and former city employees who might have had access to the information contained in the letters. The list of potential sources had been extensive, including not only direct employees of the relevant departments, but also contractors, consultants, and vendors who might have observed irregular practices during their work with the city. The investigation had been further complicated by the political sensitivities surrounding the corruption allegations. Detective Kim had worked carefully to ensure that her investigation of the letter writer didn't interfere with or compromise the separate investigations of the corruption that the letters had exposed. She had coordinated with Internal Affairs investigators and district attorney staff to avoid conflicts between the different investigative efforts. Several promising leads had emerged during the investigation, but none had definitively identified the anonymous letter writer. A former city planning department employee who had been terminated several months before the letters began appearing had been questioned extensively, but his alibi had been solid, and he had lacked access to some of the information contained in the letters. Secretary in the mayor's office who had expressed concerns about some of the practices described in the letters had been investigated as a potential source. but handwriting analysis and typing samples had ruled her out as the author. A contractor who had lost several bids under circumstances that were later revealed to be irregular had been considered as a possible source, but he had also been eliminated through forensic analysis. Detective Kim's final report had noted that the anonymous letter writer had accomplished something that official oversight mechanisms had failed to achieve. The letters had exposed genuine corruption that might otherwise have continued undetected, leading to reforms in municipal contracting procedures and the removal of several officials who had violated their public trust. The case had been closed without identifying the letter writer, but Detective Kim had reflected that the investigation had raised important questions about the relationship between anonymous disclosure and official accountability. Someone had chosen to risk potential legal consequences in order to expose genuine wrongdoing, and their actions had ultimately served the public interest, even though their methods had operated outside normal channels. The fifth file that Sarah examined dealt with the theft of a collection of rare books from the university library's special collections department during the winter break of 1993. The stolen books had included several first editions and manuscripts that were valuable both financially and historically, representing a significant loss to the university's research resources. Detective Robert Martinez had led the investigation, working closely with library security and university administrators to understand how someone had gained access to materials that were supposed to be protected by multiple layers of security. The Special Collections Department was located in a restricted area of the library that required keycard access, and the stolen books had been kept in locked cases that required additional authorization to open. The investigation had revealed that the thief had possessed detailed knowledge of the library's security systems and procedures. They had gained access during a period when the library was officially closed, but when maintenance and cleaning staff were working throughout the building. The theft had been discovered when classes resumed after winter break, and a graduate student had requested access to one of the stolen manuscripts for research purposes. Detective Martinez had interviewed all university employees who had access to the special collections area, including librarians, graduate assistants, maintenance workers, and security guards. The investigation had also included background checks on recent visitors to the special collections, since access logs showed that several researchers from other institutions had examined rare books during the weeks preceding the theft. The case had been particularly challenging because of the specialized nature of the stolen materials. Unlike typical theft cases involving easily valued items like electronics or jewelry, the rare books required expert assessment to determine their market value and to understand what kind of buyer might be interested in acquiring them illegally. Detective Martinez had worked with antiquarian book dealers and auction houses throughout the region, providing detailed descriptions of the stolen items and asking dealers to report any suspicious attempts to sell books matching their descriptions. He had also contacted law enforcement agencies in major cities, where markets for rare books might provide outlets for stolen materials. The investigation had generated several interesting leads, but no definitive breakthrough. An antiquarian book dealer in Chicago had reported being contacted by someone offering to sell manuscripts that might have matched some of the stolen items, but the potential seller had refused to provide detailed information and had broken off contact when the dealer had asked too many questions. A graduate student at another university had been investigated after purchasing rare books through online auctions that seemed inconsistent with his financial resources. But the books had proven to be different editions of works similar to but not identical to the stolen materials. Detective Martinez had also explored the possibility that the theft had been committed by someone who wanted the books for personal use rather than for sale. This theory had led to investigation of collectors and researchers who might have been motivated by obsession with particular texts rather than by simple financial gain. The case had remained active for several years, with periodic reviews when new information became available or when similar thefts occurred at other institutions. Detective Martinez had maintained contact with the university library and with rare book dealers, hoping that the stolen materials might eventually surface in circumstances that would allow for their recovery and the identification of the thief. The file had been transferred to the cold case unit when Detective Martinez retired, carrying with it his extensive notes about potential suspects and his theories about the motivation and methods that might have been involved in the theft. The stolen books had never been recovered, but the investigation had led to improvements in library security procedures that had prevented similar incidents. Sarah found herself drawn to the careful documentation of investigations that had reached their limits, not because of careless work or insufficient effort, but because some mysteries simply resisted solution despite the best efforts of skilled investigators. Each of these cold cases represented hundreds of hours of patient work by detectives who had pursued every lead and explored every possibility within the constraints of available evidence and resources. The cold case collection filled dozens of cabinets in Section M, each file representing questions that remained unanswered despite thorough investigation. Some cases might eventually be solved through advances in forensic technology or through new information that emerged years after the original investigations. Others might remain mysteries forever, joining the vast catalog of human complexity that resisted easy explanation or simple resolution. These files served as reminders that police work, despite its methodical procedures and scientific techniques, still confronted the fundamental unpredictability of human behavior. People disappeared for reasons that others might never understand, committed crimes that defied conventional logic, or made choices that left no clear trail for investigators to follow. Yet Sarah found something deeply satisfying about the way these investigations had been conducted and documented. The detectives whose work was preserved in these files had brought patience, creativity, and genuine care to cases that might have been dismissed as hopeless or irrelevant. They had treated each mystery as worthy of their best efforts, each unanswered question as deserving of thorough investigation. The archives held these stories with quiet dignity, preserving the record of careful work even when that work had not led to dramatic resolution. In the dust and silence of the cold case collection, Detective Morrison's search for Marcus Webb continued. Detective Rodriguez's pursuit of the book burglar remained active, and Detective Davis's investigation of the hit-and-run driver maintained its patient vigil for justice. These cases had become part of the city's permanent memory, documented evidence of the commitment that law enforcement brought to protecting community safety and seeking justice for victims of crime. They represented the understanding that some questions might never be answered, but that the act of asking those questions with care and persistence was itself a form of service to the ideals of justice and human dignity. In the endless archives where dust settled on forgotten truths, each file carried the weight of stories that time had gently preserved, waiting for the moment when new information might provide the missing piece that would transform mystery into understanding, question into answer, uncertainty into the satisfaction of truth finally revealed. The old courthouse stood at the corner of 5th and Main like a monument to permanence, its limestone facade weathered by decades of weather, but still projecting the dignity that its architects had intended when they designed it in 1923. Detective Sarah Chun found herself drawn to this building during her off-duty hours, walking through its corridors when court was not in session, exploring the empty rooms where so many of the cases she had studied in the archives had found their resolution. At night, when the building was officially closed but accessible to law enforcement personnel, the courthouse took on a different character entirely. The marble floors that echoed with hundreds of footsteps during business hours became vast expanses of reflective silence. The high ceilings that normally contained the drama of legal proceedings seemed to expand upward into infinite space, creating a sense of cathedral-like solemnity. that reminded visitors of the sacred nature of the work conducted within these walls. Sarah's footsteps made soft sounds against the polished stone as she walked through the main corridor, past the carved wooden doors that led to courtrooms where judges had presided over thousands of cases spanning nearly a century of legal proceedings. Each door bore a brass nameplate indicating the presiding judge. But at this hour, with court not in session, the nameplates seemed less like identifications of current occupants than like memorial markers for all the jurists who had served justice from these chambers. Courtroom 3A had been the site of many of the trials that had grown out of cases she had been reading about in the archives. The double doors opened silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a space that managed to be both grand and intimate, designed to inspire respect for legal proceedings while maintaining the human scale necessary for the careful examination of evidence and testimony. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, elevated above the rest of the space in a way that emphasized both the authority and the responsibility of judicial decision-making. The dark wood had been polished to a deep luster that reflected the overhead lights, creating an almost mirror-like surface that seemed to hold the memory of every gavel strike, every ruling, every moment when the weight of law had been brought to bear on human conflict. Sarah walked slowly down the center aisle between the gallery benches, feeling the weight of all the proceedings that had taken place in this space. The prosecution and defense tables faced each other across the well of the court, positioned to facilitate the adversarial process that formed the foundation of the American legal system, yet close enough together to remind all participants that they were engaged in a shared search for truth and justice. The jury box stood empty now, its 12 chairs arranged in perfect alignment, ready for the next group of citizens who would be called upon to deliberate over the facts presented to them and render judgment according to their understanding of law and evidence. Sarah had always been struck by the faith that the legal system placed in ordinary people, trusting them to set aside their personal biases and prejudices in order to weigh evidence fairly and reach decisions that would affect the lives of strangers. She settled into one of the gallery benches, allowing herself to imagine the trials that had taken place in this courtroom over the decades. The Marcus Webb missing person case had never come to trial, remaining forever in the liminal space between investigation and resolution. But many of the other cases she had read about in the archives had found their way here, where the careful documentation of police work had been transformed into the formal presentations of legal argument. The burglary case involving young Tommy Morrison had been resolved through plea negotiations that had taken place in the smaller conference room adjacent to this courtroom. But the book burglary case had required a full trial when the perpetrator had finally been identified. Several years after Detective Rodriguez had transferred the case to the cold case unit, the trial had been unusual because the defendant, when finally apprehended, had proven to be a retired professor, suffering from early-stage dementia who had been compulsively collecting books without understanding that his actions constituted theft. Case had raised complex questions about criminal responsibility and mental competency that had required careful consideration by both judge and jury. The defendant's family had testified about his gradual cognitive decline and his lifelong passion for books and learning. The victims had spoken about the violation they had felt when their personal libraries were stolen, but also about their sympathy for someone whose crime had been motivated by illness rather than malice. The resolution had been as unusual as the crime itself. The defendant had been sentenced to community service at the public library, where his extensive knowledge of literature and his genuine love of books had made him a valuable volunteer in helping patrons locate materials and in organizing donation drives for underserved communities. The sentence had transformed his compulsive book collecting into a socially beneficial activity while providing him with the mental stimulation that seemed to slow the progression of his cognitive decline. Sarah found herself thinking about the wisdom that could emerge from the careful deliberation that characterized the best legal proceedings. The judge in the book burglary case had crafted a sentence that addressed the needs of the victims, the limitations of the defendant, and the interests of the community in a way that purely punitive measures might not have achieved. The courtroom had become a space where human complexity could be acknowledged and addressed rather than simply categorized and dismissed. From courtroom 3A, Sarah walked down the corridor to the smaller chambers where judges conducted hearings on procedural matters and where attorneys met to negotiate plea agreements and settlements. These rooms lacked the formal grandeur of the main courtrooms, but they served equally important functions in the administration of justice, providing spaces where the detailed work of legal resolution could be conducted away from the public attention that full trials attracted. Judge Harrison's chambers had been the site of many such proceedings over the years. The office was lined with law books and legal precedents, creating an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation that seemed appropriate for the careful consideration of complex legal questions. The judge's desk faced two comfortable chairs where attorneys could present their arguments and work through the practical details of case resolution. Sarah had read the transcripts of many hearings that had taken place in this office, sessions where the formal adversarial process of courtroom proceedings had been supplemented by the more collaborative approach that characterizes much actual legal work. Attorneys who argued vigorously against each other in court often worked together in chambers to find solutions that served their clients' interests while maintaining the integrity of the legal system. The domestic violence case that Officer Chun had documented so carefully had been resolved through proceedings in this office, where the defendant had agreed to participate in counseling and anger management programs in exchange for reduced charges and the opportunity to maintain his relationship with his children under supervised conditions. The resolution had required extensive coordination between the court, social services agencies, and law enforcement to ensure that the victim's safety was protected while providing the defendant with opportunities for rehabilitation. Judge Harrison had developed a reputation for creative sentencing that addressed the underlying causes of criminal behavior rather than simply imposing punishment for its effects. The case files that documented his decisions revealed a judicial philosophy that emphasized restoration and rehabilitation wherever possible, while maintaining appropriate concern for public safety and victim rights. The conference room, adjacent to Judge Harrison's chambers, had been the site of many victim impact hearings, where people who had been affected by crimes had the opportunity to speak directly about how those crimes had affected their lives. These proceedings often provided a form of closure that purely punitive measures could not achieve, giving victims a voice in the legal process, while educating defendants about the real-world consequences of their actions. Sarah walked down to the basement level of the courthouse, where the holding cells and processing areas provided a different perspective on the intersection of crime and justice. These spaces lacked the dignity and formality of the courtrooms above, but they served essential functions in the legal process, providing secure areas where defendants could be held before hearings and where the practical details of custody and transport could be managed. The holding cells were small but clean, designed to provide basic safety and comfort for people who were waiting for their cases to be heard. Each cell contained a bench, a small sink, and a toilet, the minimal furnishings necessary for short-term detention. The bars were painted institutional green, a color chosen for its calming psychological effects rather than for any aesthetic considerations. Sarah had read reports from officers who had spent time in these holding areas, documenting their observations of how people responded to the stress of arrest and detention. Many defendants arrived angry or frightened, but the quiet atmosphere of the courthouse often had a calming effect as people began to understand that they were entering a process designed to address their situation fairly and systematically. The processing area included fingerprinting stations and photography equipment used to create the official records that would follow defendants through their interactions with the legal system. These procedures, while routine for law enforcement personnel, often marked significant moments in the lives of people who had never been arrested before, representing their formal entry into a system that would judge their actions according to standards of law and evidence. Officer Martinez had written thoughtfully about his experiences working in the courthouse processing area, noting how the transition from street arrest to formal legal proceedings often created opportunities for reflection and communication that were not possible in the immediate aftermath of criminal incidents. Many defendants who had been hostile or uncooperative during arrest became more willing to engage constructively with the legal process once they understood its procedures and protections. The courthouse also included interview rooms where attorneys met with their clients to prepare for hearings and trials. These small, private spaces provided the confidential environment necessary for effective legal representation, allowing defendants to speak freely about their situations without fear of their words being used against them by law enforcement or prosecutors. Sarah observed that these interview rooms were designed to facilitate honest communication between attorneys and clients, with comfortable seating and adequate lighting that created an atmosphere of professional consultation rather than institutional detention. The quality of legal representation often depended on the ability of attorneys to establish trust and understanding with their clients, work that required privacy and time that these rooms were designed to provide. The law library on the courthouse's second floor served both legal professionals and members of the public who needed access to legal information for their cases. The room was lined with bound volumes of legal codes, court decisions, and procedural guides, creating a comprehensive resource for understanding the legal framework within which all criminal cases were decided. Sarah found something deeply reassuring about the existence of this library: the way it represented the transparency and accessibility that characterized the American legal system at its best. Any person facing criminal charges had the right to examine the laws that governed their case and to understand the precedents that might affect their situation. The library provided the resources necessary for informed participation in legal proceedings, regardless of a person's economic status or educational background. The reference desk was staffed by law librarians who specialized in helping non-attorneys navigate the complex world of legal research. These professionals served as bridges between the formal language of legal documents and the practical needs of people trying to understand their rights and obligations under law. Their patient assistance had been crucial to many defendants who chose to represent themselves or who needed to understand the work being done on their behalf by court-appointed attorneys. The courthouse's jury assembly room represented another aspect of the democratic foundation of the legal system, the space where ordinary citizens gathered to fulfill their obligation to participate in the administration of justice. The room was designed to accommodate large numbers of people comfortably while they waited to be called for jury selection, with seating arranged to facilitate both individual reflection and group interaction. Sarah had observed jury selection proceedings from the gallery, watching as attorneys questioned potential jurors about their backgrounds, experiences, and attitudes that might affect their ability to evaluate evidence fairly. The process represented a remarkable exercise in democratic participation, as strangers were asked to set aside their personal interests and biases in order to serve the broader community interest in fair and impartial justice. The jury deliberation rooms were small private spaces where the actual work of reaching verdicts took place away from the public attention that characterized courtroom proceedings. These rooms contained only a table, chairs, and the evidence that had been admitted during trial, creating an environment where jurors could focus entirely on the facts and law that were relevant to their decision-making. The transcripts of post-trial interviews with jurors revealed the serious consideration that most people brought to their deliberations. The way they wrestled with complex questions of fact and law, even when the stakes of their decisions were not immediately visible to them. Many jurors spoke about feeling the weight of responsibility for making decisions that would affect the lives of defendants, victims, and the broader community. The courthouse's Victim Services Office provided support and information to people who had been affected by crimes and who needed assistance navigating the legal process. The office was designed to be welcoming and comfortable, with soft lighting and private consultation areas where victims could speak confidentially about their needs and concerns. Victim advocates worked to ensure that people who had been harmed by crimes understood their rights within the legal system and had access to resources that could help them recover from their experiences. This work often involved coordination with social service agencies, medical providers, and counseling services that could address needs that went beyond the immediate legal resolution of criminal cases. The courthouse's probation office managed the supervision of defendants who had been sentenced to community-based alternatives to incarceration. Probation officers worked with offenders to develop and monitor compliance with court orders while providing connections to services that could address underlying issues that had contributed to criminal behavior. Sarah read through case files documenting successful probation supervision that had helped offenders rebuild their lives while maintaining public safety. These cases demonstrated the potential for the legal system to serve rehabilitative functions that purely punitive approaches could not achieve, providing structure and support that enabled people to address problems that had led to their involvement in criminal activity. The courthouse building itself had been constructed during an era when public architecture was intended to inspire civic pride and respect for democratic institutions. The high ceilings, marble columns, and carefully proportioned spaces created an atmosphere of dignity and permanence that reminded visitors of the importance of the work conducted within these walls. The building's design also reflected practical considerations related to security, accessibility, and efficient workflow that were necessary for the effective administration of justice. Multiple entrances allowed for the separation of different types of courthouse users, while the layout of courtrooms and support spaces facilitated the movement of cases through various stages of legal proceedings. Sarah found herself appreciating the way the courthouse balanced grandeur with functionality, creating spaces that honored the importance of legal proceedings while providing the practical environment necessary for effective legal work. The building stood as a physical manifestation of the community's commitment to justice, a permanent structure dedicated to the ongoing work of resolving conflicts and maintaining social order through law. As she walked through the empty corridors late at night, Sarah could sense the presence of all the cases that had been heard within these walls, the thousands of decisions that had been made, the countless hours of testimony that had been given, the careful deliberations that had taken place in pursuit of justice. The courthouse held these memories with quiet dignity, maintaining its readiness to serve the community's need for fair and impartial resolution of legal disputes. The building's night lighting created dramatic shadows and highlights that emphasized the architectural details that might be overlooked during busy daytime hours. The carved moldings, decorative stonework, and carefully crafted woodwork revealed the pride and skill that had gone into the courthouse's construction, the intention to create a structure worthy of the important work that would be conducted within it. The courthouse also contained administrative offices where the clerical work of legal proceedings was managed. The filing of documents, scheduling of hearings, and maintenance of records that enabled the legal system to function efficiently. These offices lacked the dramatic character of courtrooms, but they served essential functions in ensuring that legal proceedings were conducted according to proper procedures and that accurate records were maintained for future reference. Sarah understood that the courthouse represented more than just a building where legal proceedings took place. It was a symbol of the community's commitment to resolving conflicts through law rather than through violence or arbitrary power. The careful procedures, formal protocols, and elaborate safeguards that characterized legal proceedings all served to ensure that justice was administered fairly and consistently, regardless of the personal characteristics or social status of those involved. The empty courthouse at night seemed to embody the timeless nature of the human struggle for justice, the ongoing effort to create social systems that protected individual rights while maintaining community order. The building would be here tomorrow and the day after that, ready to host the next set of proceedings, the next search for truth, the next attempt to balance competing claims and interests in the pursuit of fair resolution. In the silence of empty courtrooms, Sarah could feel the weight of all the verdicts that had been rendered, all the sentences that had been imposed, all the lives that had been affected by the careful application of law to human conflict. The courthouse held these decisions with quiet authority, maintaining its commitment to the ideal that justice could be achieved through patient attention to evidence, careful consideration of competing arguments, and the collective wisdom of citizens called upon to serve their community through participation in legal proceedings. The building stood as a monument to the possibility that human conflicts could be resolved through reason rather than force, through law rather than arbitrary power, through the collective commitment of citizens to the principles of fairness and equality that form the foundation of democratic society. Empty courtrooms held the echoes of every verdict ever spoken, their silence more profound than any judgment, their readiness more powerful than any sentence, their patience more enduring than any human conflict that might require their service in the ongoing pursuit of justice. The Riverside district stretched along the eastern edge of the city like a patchwork quilt of lives, woven together by proximity, habit, and the thousand small interactions that create the texture of neighborhood life. Detective Sarah Chun found herself walking these streets during her evening hours, not pursuing any particular investigation, but simply observing the way that crime and its aftermath moved through communities like ripples in still water, touching lives in ways both obvious and subtle. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman lived at 247 Maple Street, in the same house where she had raised 3 children and tended the same garden for 42 years. Her story had been documented in multiple police reports over the decades, not because she was a repeat offender or frequent victim, but because her life intersected with crime in the peripheral ways that characterized most people's relationship with law enforcement. She was a witness to things, a person who called when she was concerned, a neighbor whose observations helped officers understand the social context in which incidents occurred. The first police report that mentioned Mrs. Hoffman dated back to 1987, when she had called about suspicious activity in the vacant house next door. The Kowalski family had moved to Arizona the previous month, leaving their house empty while they decided whether to sell or rent. Mrs. Hoffman had noticed lights on at unusual hours and had seen unfamiliar people coming and going at times. When the house should have been unoccupied, Officer Patricia Kim had responded to Mrs. Hoffman's call with the patience that characterized community policing at its best. Rather than dismissing the report as the overvigilance of a nosy neighbor, Officer Kim had taken the time to understand the situation from Mrs. Hoffman's perspective. She had lived next to the Kowalski family for 15 years, knew their routines and habits, and could distinguish between normal activity and signs that something might be wrong. The investigation had revealed that the Kowalski house was being used by teenagers from the neighborhood as an informal gathering place. They had found a way to enter through a basement window that hadn't been properly secured, and had been using the empty rooms for parties and social activities that their parents might not have approved of. The situation wasn't technically criminal, since no property was being damaged and nothing was being stolen, but it represented the kind of minor disorder that could escalate if not addressed. Thoughtfully. Officer Kim's report documented her approach to resolving the situation through community engagement rather than formal law enforcement action. She had contacted the teenagers' parents, explained the situation, and worked with the Kowalski family to better secure their property while they were away. She had also spent time with Mrs. Hoffman, helping her understand the difference between criminal activity and the normal social behavior of young people. While acknowledging her legitimate concern for neighborhood security, the resolution had satisfied everyone involved. The teenagers had found alternative places for their social activities. The Kowalski house had been properly secured, and Mrs. Hoffman had developed a better understanding of when to call police and when to address concerns through direct communication with neighbors. Officer Kim's report had become a model for handling similar situations, demonstrating how patient community policing could address problems before they escalated into more serious issues. 3 years later, Mrs. Hoffman had again contacted police, this time about her concern for her neighbor across the street, 70-8-Old Harold Morrison. Mr. Morrison lived alone and had developed increasingly erratic behavior that worried the neighbors who had known him for decades. He had begun working in his yard at all hours of the night, sometimes using power tools that disturbed the sleep of nearby residents. Detective James Rodriguez had responded to the call, approaching the situation as a potential mental health crisis rather than a simple noise complaint. His investigation had revealed that Mr. Morrison was struggling with the early stages of dementia and was becoming confused about time and appropriate social behavior. The nighttime yard work was his attempt to maintain the property standards that had been important to him throughout his adult life. But his declining cognitive function had disrupted his ability to recognize appropriate times for such activities. Detective Rodriguez had worked with Adult Protective Services and Mr. Morrison's family to develop a support plan that would allow him to remain in his home while ensuring that his needs were met and that his behavior didn't create problems for neighbors. The plan had included daily check-ins from family members, modifications to his yard tools that made them quieter, and the establishment of regular visiting hours when neighbors could interact with him socially rather than only when problems arose. Mrs. Hoffman had played an important role in this support plan, volunteering to maintain informal oversight of Mr. Morrison's daily routine and to contact family members if she noticed signs that he might need assistance. Her willingness to take on this responsibility had allowed Mr. Morrison to remain in his familiar environment for several additional years, while providing peace of mind for both his family and his neighbors. Case files documented how Mrs. Hoffman's initial complaint had evolved into a community-based solution that addressed the underlying problem rather than simply treating its symptoms. Detective Rodriguez's report had noted that neighborhood residents often served as informal social workers, identifying problems early and providing ongoing support that prevented situations from escalating to the point where formal intervention became necessary. 5 years after the Morrison case, Mrs. Hoffman had been the victim of a burglary that had shaken her confidence in the security of her neighborhood. The crime had occurred during a Tuesday afternoon when she was grocery shopping, and she had returned home to find her back door forced open and several valuable items missing from her bedroom. Officer David Martinez had investigated the burglary with the thoroughness that such violations deserved. But he had also recognized that Mrs. Hoffman's emotional response to the crime required attention beyond the collection of evidence and filing of reports. She had lived in the same house for decades without experiencing serious crime, and the burglary had challenged her fundamental assumptions about safety and community. Investigation had revealed that the burglary was part of a series of similar crimes targeting elderly residents during daytime, hours when they were most likely to be away from home. The perpetrator had been conducting surveillance of potential victims, learning their routines and identifying times when houses would be unoccupied. Mrs. Hoffman had been targeted not randomly, but because someone had observed her predictable shopping schedule and had identified her house as containing items worth stealing. Officer Martinez had worked with Mrs. Hoffman to improve her home security and to vary her daily routines in ways that would make her less predictable to potential criminals. He had also organized a neighborhood watch meeting where residents could share information about suspicious activity and coordinate informal surveillance that would make the area less attractive to burglars. The broader investigation had led to the arrest of 17-year-old Marcus Thompson, whose family lived 3 blocks away from Mrs. Hoffman. Marcus had been burglarizing homes to support a drug habit that his family had been unaware of, and his arrest had shocked neighbors who had known him since childhood as a polite, well-behaved young man. The case had raised difficult questions about community, responsibility, and the relationship between crime and social support. Marcus's family had been struggling with economic pressures that had made it difficult for them to provide the kind of supervision and guidance that might have prevented his involvement in criminal activity. His drug use had developed gradually and had been hidden from family members who were working multiple jobs to maintain their household. Mrs. Hoffman had surprised everyone by asking to participate in Marcus's sentencing hearing, not to demand harsh punishment, but to speak about the impact that crime had on community trust and to encourage him to understand how his actions had affected people who had been part of his neighborhood environment since childhood. Her statement had been both firm and compassionate, acknowledging the harm that had been done while expressing hope that Marcus could find better ways to address whatever problems had led to his criminal behavior. Resolution of Marcus's case had included restitution to Mrs. Hoffman and other victims, community service work in the neighborhood where he had committed his crimes, and participation in drug treatment programs that addressed the underlying issues that had motivated his criminal activity. Mrs. Hoffman had volunteered to supervise some of his community service work, providing him with an opportunity to make direct amends for the harm he had caused. Detective Martinez's reports had documented how this case had strengthened rather than weakened community bonds in the Riverside district. The burglary had initially created fear and suspicion among neighbors, but the thoughtful resolution had demonstrated the possibility of addressing crime through restorative rather than purely punitive approaches. That Mrs. Hoffman's role in these cases illustrated the way that ordinary citizens served as informal partners in community policing, providing the local knowledge and ongoing observation that helped law enforcement understand problems in their full social context. Her 42 years of residence in the same neighborhood had given her a perspective on change and continuity that was invaluable to officers who needed to understand how current incidents fit into larger patterns of community life. The Riverside district also included the Chun family, who had emigrated from Taiwan in 1985 and had gradually built a successful restaurant business while raising 2 children and establishing themselves as respected members of their neighborhood. Their story had intersected with law enforcement in ways that illustrated both the challenges and opportunities that characterized immigrant communities' relationship with police. The first police report involving the Chun family had been filed in 1989, when vandals had spray-painted racial slurs on the windows of their restaurant and had broken several items in their outdoor seating area. Officer Susan Kim had investigated the incident as a hate crime, understanding that the vandalism represented not just property damage, but an attack on the family's sense of belonging and security in their adopted community. The investigation had revealed that the vandalism was connected to broader tensions about economic change in the neighborhood, as some longtime residents had blamed new businesses for rising property values and changing commercial character. The Chun family's restaurant had been successful, but some neighbors had resented what they perceived as competition for customers and economic opportunities that had previously been controlled by established local families. Officer Kim had worked to address both the immediate crime and the underlying tensions that had motivated it. She had coordinated with community leaders to organize public meetings where residents could discuss their concerns about neighborhood change in constructive rather than destructive ways. She had also worked with the Chun family to improve security for their business while helping them understand resources available for dealing with hate crimes and discrimination. Resolution had involved prosecution of the teenagers who had committed the vandalism, but Officer Kim's report had emphasized the importance of addressing the social conditions that had made such crimes seem acceptable to young people who might not have been inherently prejudiced, but who had absorbed negative attitudes from adult community members. The case had led to the establishment of a neighborhood diversity committee that worked to build bridges between longtime residents and newer arrivals, creating opportunities for social interaction that helped people understand their common interests rather than focusing on their differences. The Chun family had played an active role in this committee, using their restaurant as a meeting place and providing food for community events that brought neighbors together. 5 years later, the Chun family had been the victims of an armed robbery that had tested their commitment to remaining in the neighborhood and had challenged the community's progress toward inclusion and mutual support. 2 men had entered the restaurant during closing time, demanding money from the cash register and threatening Mrs. Chun with a knife when she had initially been too frightened to understand their demands. Detective Robert Davis had investigated the robbery with the understanding that crimes against immigrant families often had impacts that extended beyond the immediate victims to affect the broader community's sense of safety and belonging. The Chun family had been traumatized, not only by the robbery itself, but by fears that they might be targeted because of their ethnicity or their perceived status as outsiders. Investigation had revealed that the robbery was part of a series of crimes targeting small businesses throughout the city, with no evidence that the Chun family had been selected because of their ethnicity. The perpetrators had been opportunistic, criminals looking for easy targets rather than hate criminals motivated by prejudice against immigrants. Detective Davis had worked with the Chun family to understand the broader context of the crime, while also addressing their specific security needs. He had coordinated with other business owners to improve security measures throughout the commercial district, and had helped establish a system of mutual support among merchants who could watch out for each other's safety. The arrest of the robbery suspects had provided some closure for the Chun family, but Detective Davis's report had emphasized the ongoing work of rebuilding their sense of security and belonging in the community. The robbery had temporarily damaged their confidence in the neighborhood's safety, but the support they had received from neighbors and other business owners had ultimately strengthened their commitment to remaining and continuing to contribute to the community's economic and social life. The Chun family's teenage daughter, Amy, had later become involved in neighborhood youth programs that brought together young people from different ethnic and economic backgrounds. Her participation had helped bridge cultural divides while providing her with leadership opportunities that might not have been available in a more homogeneous Community. Detective Davis's final report on the Chun family's case had noted that their experience illustrated both the vulnerabilities and the resilience that characterized immigrant communities' relationship with crime and law enforcement. The family had faced real challenges and dangers, but their integration into the neighborhood's social and economic life had provided them with resources for recovery and support that had ultimately made them stronger and more connected to their community. The Riverside District's experience with crime and community response had been documented in dozens of police reports that showed how law enforcement, when practiced with patience and cultural sensitivity, could serve as a bridge between different communities rather than as a source of division and conflict. Officers who took the time to understand the social context of crimes could often find solutions that addressed underlying problems rather than simply treating their symptoms. The Morrison family, longtime residents of Riverside Drive, had experienced their own intersection with crime when their teenage son, David, had been arrested for selling marijuana to classmates at the local high school. The arrest had shocked parents who thought they had been providing adequate supervision and guidance, and had forced the family to confront difficult questions about drug use, peer pressure, and parental responsibility. Officer Lisa Thompson had approached David's case with an understanding that teenage drug violations often reflected broader issues of social development and family communication rather than simply criminal intent. Her investigation had revealed that David had begun selling drugs not because of financial need or criminal ambition, but because he had been seeking social acceptance from classmates who had more money and higher social status than his working-class family could provide. The case had required Officer Thompson to balance law enforcement responsibilities with recognition of the developmental challenges that affected teenagers' decision-making abilities. David's drug selling was clearly illegal and potentially harmful to other young people, but his motivation had been rooted in normal adolescent desires for peer acceptance rather than in criminal thinking. Officer Thompson had worked with David's parents to develop a response that addressed both the legal consequences of his actions and the underlying social needs that had motivated his involvement in drug activity. The resolution had included community service work at a local drug treatment center, participation in counseling programs that addressed issues of self-esteem and peer pressure, and ongoing supervision that helped David find legal ways to achieve the social acceptance he had been seeking. The Morrison family's experience had led to their involvement in parent education programs that helped other families recognize early warning signs of teenage substance abuse and develop communication skills that could prevent problems before they required legal intervention. David had eventually become a peer counselor for other teenagers who were struggling with similar issues, using his experience to help others avoid the mistakes he had made. Officer Thompson's report had emphasized how David's case illustrated the potential for restorative justice approaches that focused on rehabilitation and community healing rather than purely punitive responses to teenage crime. The family's willingness to take responsibility for addressing the underlying issues had made it possible to resolve the case in ways that strengthened rather than weakened community bonds. The Riverside District also included elderly residents like Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski, who had returned from Arizona after discovering that retirement in an unfamiliar community was less satisfying than they had expected. Their homecoming had been complicated by their discovery that their house had been the site of unauthorized parties during their absence, requiring them to repair damage and restore security while rebuilding relationships with neighbors they had left behind. Their experience had illustrated how crime prevention often required ongoing community engagement rather than simply improved physical security measures. The unauthorized use of their empty house had occurred not because of inadequate locks or alarms, but because neighborhood social networks had been disrupted by their departure and had not been replaced by formal surveillance systems. The Kowalski family's return had required them to re-establish their place in neighborhood social networks that had continued to evolve during their absence. They had needed to learn about new residents, changing business patterns, and shifts in the informal systems of mutual support that helped neighbors look out for each other's welfare and property. Detective Martinez had worked with the Kowalskis to understand how their experience reflected broader patterns of neighborhood change and stability. Their temporary departure had created a gap in local social networks that had made their property vulnerable to unauthorized use. But their return had provided an opportunity to strengthen those networks through renewed engagement and mutual support. The Kowalski case had led to the development of neighborhood protocols for monitoring vacant properties and maintaining security during temporary absences. These protocols had involved cooperation between police, neighbors, and property owners to ensure that empty houses didn't become targets for unauthorized use or criminal activity. Throughout the Riverside district, police reports documented how crime and its prevention were woven into the daily fabric of community life through the actions of ordinary people who took responsibility for their neighbors' welfare and their neighborhoods. Safety, Mrs. Hoffman's vigilant observation, the Chun family's resilience, David Morrison's rehabilitation, and the Kowalskis' reintegration all represented different aspects of the ongoing work of maintaining community through cooperation between law enforcement and citizens. Detective Sarah Chun's evening walks through these neighborhoods had given her a deeper appreciation for the complexity of community policing and the Kizintizvainta way that effective law enforcement required understanding of social relationships that extended far beyond the immediate facts of individual crimes. The invisible threads that connected neighbors created networks of mutual support and informal surveillance that were essential to crime prevention and community healing. In the quiet spaces between neighbors, she could sense the gentle web of community that crime disturbed but never truly broke. The resilient bonds of mutual care and shared responsibility that made neighborhoods more than simply collections of individual households. These connections required cultivation and protection, but they provided the foundation for all successful efforts to maintain safety and justice through cooperation between police and the people they served. The Central Police Station transformed after midnight, settling into rhythms that belonged entirely to the night shift. Detective Michael Santos had worked these hours for 8 years, long enough to understand that policing during the quiet hours required a different temperament than the urgency and chaos that characterized daytime law enforcement. The night brought its own kinds of emergencies, its own patterns of human behavior, its own opportunities for the patient work that formed the foundation of effective community policing. The station's main desk area took on a cathedral-like quality during these hours, with overhead lighting creating pools of warm illumination that contrasted with the darkness visible through the tall windows facing Main Street. Sergeant Patricia Kim worked the front desk with the steady efficiency that made her the anchor of the night shift, processing paperwork, coordinating dispatch calls, and providing the calm presence that helped both officers and citizens navigate the unique challenges of after-hours police work. The clock on the wall behind Sergeant Kim's desk marked the passage of time with soft, mechanical sounds that created a metronome for the station's nighttime rhythm. 2:15 became 2:30, then 3 o'clock, each hour bringing its own particular quality of silence punctuated by the radio traffic that connected the station to patrol units moving through the sleeping city. Detective Santos found deep satisfaction in the contemplative aspects of night shift work, the way that reduced activity created opportunities for thorough investigation and careful documentation that were often impossible during busier daytime hours. His desk was positioned near a window that looked out onto the city's downtown district, where streetlights created geometric patterns of light and shadow that shifted subtly as the night progressed. First case file on his desk dealt with a domestic disturbance that had been reported at 11:30 the previous evening, requiring the kind of careful follow-up work that could be done properly only during the quiet hours when officers had time to think deeply about complex family situations. Officer David Rodriguez had responded to the initial call, finding the Williams family in crisis, following an argument between parents and their adult son that had escalated to the point where neighbors had called police. The initial report described a situation that required delicate handling, involving 25-year-old Marcus Williams, who had been living with his parents since losing his job at the local manufacturing plant 6 months earlier. The argument had begun over Marcus's reluctance to actively seek new employment and had escalated when his father had threatened to change the locks if Marcus didn't demonstrate more effort to improve his situation. Officer Rodriguez's preliminary assessment had identified the underlying issues that were creating tension in the Williams household: economic stress, generational differences about work and responsibility, and the challenge of maintaining family relationships when adult children return to their childhood homes during periods of financial difficulty. The immediate conflict had been diffused through patient conversation, but Officer Rodriguez had recognized that the family would benefit from ongoing support to address the underlying issues. Detective Santos's follow-up work involved connecting the Williams family with resources that could help them navigate their situation constructively rather than allowing tensions to escalate into more serious problems. He had contacted the local employment services office to arrange job counseling for Marcus and had provided information about family mediation services that could help all three family members communicate more effectively about their expectations and concerns. The case required ongoing documentation as Detective Santos tracked the family's progress and ensured that the resources he had recommended were actually helping to improve their situation. Marcus had begun participating in a job training program that would prepare him for work in the growing healthcare services sector, while his parents had learned communication techniques that helped them express their concerns without creating defensive responses. Detective Santos's reports documented how this kind of proactive follow-up work could prevent family conflicts from escalating into more serious legal problems. The initial domestic disturbance call could have been handled simply by separating the parties and advising them to work out their differences privately. But the night shift's reduced caseload had allowed for the kind of comprehensive approach that addressed underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms. The second case file dealt with a series of noise complaints that had been reported from the Riverside Apartments, a large complex that housed many of the city's younger residents and often generated calls related to parties, loud music, and other activities that disturbed neighbors who were trying to sleep. Officer Lisa Martinez had been assigned to investigate the complaints, approaching them not as simple violations of noise ordinances but as opportunities to build better communication between neighbors with different lifestyles and schedules. Complaints had originated from Mrs. Dorothy Chun, a retired nurse who had moved to the apartment complex seeking affordable housing in a convenient location, but had found herself struggling with the noise levels that were normal for a building filled primarily with people in their 20s and 30s. Her calls to police had become increasingly frequent as she had grown more frustrated with what she perceived as inconsiderate behavior by her younger neighbors. Officer Martinez's investigation had revealed that the noise problems were not the result of malicious intent or deliberate disrespect. but rather reflected the challenges of creating community among people with very different living situations and expectations. Many of the younger residents worked service industry jobs that required them to work evenings and weekends, creating schedules that conflicted with Mrs. Chun's more traditional routine. The resolution had required Officer Martinez to serve as a mediator between different groups of residents, helping them understand each other's legitimate needs while finding practical solutions that could reduce conflicts. She had organized a residents' meeting, where people could discuss their concerns openly and work together to establish guidelines for shared living that respected everyone's need for both social interaction and peaceful rest. Detective Santos's follow-up documentation tracked the success of this community-based approach to resolving noise complaints. The residents' meeting had led to the establishment of informal quiet hours that balanced the needs of people who worked different schedules, while also creating opportunities for social interaction that helped neighbors get to know each other as individuals rather than simply as sources of annoyance. The case illustrated how effective police work often involved helping people solve their own problems rather than imposing external solutions that might not address the underlying issues that created conflicts. Officer Martinez's patient mediation had transformed a series of individual complaints into an opportunity for community building that had ultimately made the apartment complex a more pleasant place for everyone to live out. The third case file documented Detective Santos's investigation of vandalism at Roosevelt High School, where someone had been spray painting messages on exterior walls during weekend nights when the building was unoccupied. The vandalism had been discovered by maintenance staff on Monday mornings, creating a pattern of damage that suggested systematic rather than random criminal activity. The investigation had required Detective Santos to think creatively about the motivation behind the vandalism, since the messages being spray-painted were not typical gang tags or random destruction, but rather seemed to be attempts at political and social commentary. The vandal had been painting slogans about educational funding, student rights, and criticisms of school administration policies, suggesting someone with genuine concerns about the educational system rather than simply destructive intent. Detective Santos had worked with school administrators to understand the context of the concerns being expressed through the vandalism, recognizing that the criminal activity might reflect legitimate grievances that could be addressed through constructive channels rather than simply through law enforcement. The investigation had revealed tensions within the school community about budget cuts, curriculum changes, and disciplinary policies that affected students and staff. The breakthrough in the case had come through Detective Santos's decision to approach the vandalism as a form of communication rather than simply as property damage. He had worked with school counselors to create opportunities for students to express their concerns about school policies through legitimate channels, while also improving security measures that would prevent unauthorized access to school buildings during off hours. The vandal had eventually been identified as 18-year-old Sarah Morrison, a senior who had been frustrated by what she perceived as the administration's lack of responsiveness to student concerns about educational quality and fairness. Her arrest had been handled with attention to the underlying issues that had motivated her criminal activity, with a resolution that included community service, work at the school, and participation in student government activities that gave her constructive ways to advocate for change. Detective Santos's final report had noted that Sarah's case illustrated the potential for restorative justice approaches that addressed both the harm caused by criminal activity and the legitimate concerns that might have motivated such activity. Her vandalism had been clearly illegal and had caused real damage to school property, but her subsequent involvement in legitimate Advocacy had demonstrated the possibility of channeling frustration into constructive action. The fourth case file dealt with a missing person report that had been filed by the family of 23-year-old David Kim, who had failed to return home from his job at a downtown restaurant and had not been seen or heard from for more than 48 hours. The case required the kind of systematic investigation that could be conducted most effectively during night shift hours when Detective Santos had time to pursue multiple leads without interruption. The initial investigation had revealed that David had left his restaurant job at approximately 11:30 on a Thursday evening, following his normal routine of cleaning and closing the kitchen before walking to his car in the nearby parking garage. Security cameras had captured him leaving the restaurant and walking toward the garage, but there was no footage of him actually reaching his vehicle or leaving the area. Detective Santos had expanded the investigation to include hospitals, homeless shelters, and other locations where David might have gone if he had experienced some kind of medical emergency or personal crisis. The investigation had also included interviews with family members, co-workers, and friends who might have information about David's state of mind or any problems he might have been experiencing. The case had been complicated by the fact that David had recently been dealing with stress related to his immigration status and concerns about his family's financial situation. His family had emigrated from South Korea 5 years earlier, and David had been working to save money for college while also contributing to household expenses. The pressure of balancing his own educational goals with his family's immediate needs had been creating anxiety that he had not discussed openly with parents or friends. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Santos had expanded his search to include transit systems and had discovered that David had used his credit card to purchase a bus ticket to Seattle on the Friday morning after his disappearance. Further investigation had revealed that David had been accepted to a university program in Seattle, but had been afraid to tell his family that he wanted to leave his current job and move away from home. Detective Santos had contacted Seattle police and had located David at a youth hostel near the university campus, where he had been staying while trying to decide whether to enroll in school or return home to continue working. The case had been resolved through family counseling that helped David and his parents communicate about their different priorities and find ways to balance individual goals with family responsibilities. The resolution had included David's return home for several weeks of family discussion, followed by his enrollment in the Seattle University program with his family's support and understanding. Detective Santos's final report had noted that the case illustrated how missing person investigations often revealed complex family dynamics that required patient mediation rather than simply law enforcement action. The fifth case file documented an ongoing investigation of theft from construction sites throughout the downtown redevelopment area, where valuable tools and materials had been disappearing during overnight hours when sites were supposed to be secured. The thefts had been creating significant costs for construction companies while also delaying projects that were important to the city's economic development efforts. Detective Santos had approached the investigation by spending time at construction sites during night shift hours, observing security measures and looking for patterns that might explain how thieves were gaining access to supposedly secure areas. His investigation had revealed that the thefts were being committed by people with detailed knowledge of construction schedules and security procedures, suggesting that the perpetrators might be current or former industry employees. The case had required Detective Santos to build relationships with construction workers, supervisors, and security personnel who could provide information about who had access to sites and who might have the knowledge necessary to identify valuable items worth stealing. The investigation had also involved coordination with pawn shops and tool dealers who might be receiving stolen merchandise. The breakthrough had come when Detective Santos had identified a pattern in which thefts occurred primarily at sites where specific security companies were providing overnight coverage. Further investigation had revealed that one of the security guards, 42-year-old Robert Martinez, had been coordinating with accomplices to steal materials during his shifts and had been using his position to identify the most valuable items available at each site. Arrest of Martinez and his accomplices had required careful coordination to ensure that the theft ring was completely dismantled and that all stolen property was recovered. Detective Santos had worked with construction companies to improve their security measures and to develop better procedures for tracking valuable tools and materials. The case had also revealed broader issues about wages and working conditions in the security industry that might have contributed to Martinez's decision to commit theft. Detective Santos's final report had recommended review of security company hiring practices and compensation policies that might help prevent similar problems in the future. Throughout the night shift, Detective Santos had worked steadily through these cases while maintaining awareness of radio, traffic, and patrol activities that might require his immediate attention. The reduced pace of night shift work had allowed him to give each case the thorough attention it deserved, pursuing leads and conducting interviews with the patients that effective investigation required. The station's break room served as an informal gathering place where night shift officers could share information and coordinate their activities during the quiet hours between calls. Detective Santos often found that some of his best insights about ongoing cases came through casual conversations with patrol officers who had observed patterns or made connections that might not have been apparent to someone working on individual cases in isolation. Officer Jennifer Thompson had noticed that several of the domestic disturbance calls she had been responding to seemed to involve families who were struggling with unemployment or economic stress. Her observations had helped Detective Santos understand that many of the individual cases he was investigating were connected to broader economic conditions that were affecting the entire community. Officer Mark Davis had observed increased activity at several locations that were known to be gathering places for people experiencing homelessness, leading to discussions about how economic pressures might be creating new challenges for the city's social services system. His observations had provided context for understanding why certain types of crimes might be increasing and how law enforcement might need to coordinate with other agencies to address underlying causes. The night shift's collaborative approach to police work created opportunities for the kind of comprehensive understanding that was essential to effective crime prevention and community safety. Officers working different beats could share information about patterns they were observing, while detectives could provide analysis that helped patrol officers understand how individual incidents might be connected to larger trends. Detective Santos found that the quiet hours of the night shift provided ideal conditions for the careful documentation that was essential to building strong cases and ensuring that investigations were conducted according to proper procedures. The reduced interruptions allowed him to write thorough reports that captured not only the facts of each case, but also the context and analysis that would be important for prosecutors, judges, and other officers who might need to understand the cases in the future. The night shift also included responsibility for monitoring the holding cells where people arrested during evening hours were held until morning court appearances. This supervision required attention to both security and human dignity, ensuring that people in custody were safe and treated fairly while they waited for their cases to be processed through the legal system. Sergeant Kim coordinated these supervisory responsibilities with the same attention to detail that characterized all aspects of her work. ensuring that people in custody received appropriate meals, medical attention when needed, and opportunities to contact family members or attorneys. Her experience had taught her that how people were treated during their first contact with the justice system often influenced their attitudes toward law enforcement and their willingness to cooperate with legal proceedings. The station's records room remained active throughout the night shift, as officers filed reports and detectives accessed files that were needed for ongoing investigations. The careful maintenance of these records was essential to the department's ability to track patterns, coordinate investigations, and provide accurate information to courts and other agencies that relied on police documentation. Detective Santos often spent late-night hours in the records room, reviewing old cases that might be connected to current investigations and looking for patterns that could provide insights into criminal activity that might not be apparent when cases were examined individually. The quiet environment of the night shift provided ideal conditions for this kind of analytical work that required concentration and careful attention to detail. As the night shift progressed toward morning, Detective Santos could feel the rhythm of the city beginning to change. The subtle signs that indicated the approach of day shift activities and the different pace that characterized daytime police work. The night had provided opportunities for thorough investigation, careful documentation, and thoughtful analysis that would serve as the foundation for continued work on cases that required ongoing attention. The transition between night and day shifts represented one of the most important aspects of continuous law enforcement coverage, ensuring that investigations and patrol activities continued seamlessly despite changes in personnel. Detective Santos would brief his day shift counterparts about the progress that had been made on active cases, while receiving updates about new developments that had occurred during other shifts. The night shift knew secrets that daylight never sees, carrying the city's dreams and sorrows through hours when time moved differently, when patience and persistence could accomplish work that was impossible during the urgency and chaos of busier periods. In the steady rhythm of the station's after-hours operations, Detective Santos and his colleagues maintained a vigilant care that kept the community safe while most of its members slept peacefully, unaware of the quiet dedication that protected their rest and prepared for their awakening to another day of shared life in the neighborhoods. They all called home. The evidence room's photography section occupied a climate-controlled area in the basement of the police station, where thousands of images rested in careful storage, organized by date and case number in filing systems that had evolved over decades of documentation. Detective Sarah Chun found herself returning to this particular archive during her quiet explorations, drawn by the way photographs captured not just evidence, but entire moments frozen in time, preserving the texture of past investigations for future contemplation. The photographs from 1987 were stored in manila envelopes, each one labeled with careful handwriting that identified the case, the date, and the investigating officer. Unlike digital images that could be enhanced and manipulated, these physical prints carried the weight of their analog origins, the grain and color saturation that marked them as artifacts from a specific period in the department's history. Detective Patricia Morrison had taken most of the photographs from the Riverside District burglary case, working with the same methodical care that characterized all aspects of her investigation. The images showed Mrs. Henderson's bedroom exactly as she had found it after the break-in, with the empty space on her dresser, where her grandmother's jewelry box had once sat, creating a void that spoke more eloquently than any written description could convey. The photograph captured details that might have been missed in the initial excitement of discovering the crime. The undisturbed arrangement of other items on the dresser, the way afternoon sunlight fell through lace curtains to create patterns on the hardwood floor, the sense of violation that came not from obvious destruction, but from the subtle wrongness of absence. Looking at the image 37 years later, Sarah could feel the quiet sadness that must have filled Mrs. Henderson when she realized that this small piece of her family's history had been taken. Detective Morrison had also photographed the jewelry box after its recovery, placing it on a neutral background in the station's evidence room to document its condition and contents. The box appeared undamaged, its faded floral pattern still intact, but something in the way the light fell across its surface suggested the journey it had taken from Mrs. Henderson's dresser to Tommy Morrison's woodland fort and back to official custody. The photographs from the medical clinic where the box had been briefly displayed showed it in a different context, surrounded by magazines and other donated items in a waiting room where people sought healing and comfort. The image captured an accidental moment of grace, where a stolen object had found temporary purpose in serving others before returning to its rightful owner. The next series of photographs documented the series of artistic graffiti that had appeared throughout the downtown area during the same period. Images that Sergeant Thompson had taken as part of his investigation into what the police reports had termed unauthorized public art. The photographs revealed the careful composition and thoughtful execution that had characterized Maria Santos's nocturnal urban poetry, showing how she had worked with the existing textures and architectural features of buildings rather than simply defacing them. The images captured the flowing lines and organic forms that had transformed neglected walls into canvases for Maria's vision of the city's hidden beauty. Even in the stark lighting of police photography, the artwork showed a sophisticated understanding of color, movement, and spatial relationships that elevated it far above simple vandalism. Sergeant Thompson had documented each piece from multiple angles, creating a comprehensive record that revealed the artist's skill and vision. The final photographs in this series showed the community center mural that had grown out of Maria's arrest and the creative sentencing that had channeled her artistic impulses into legal venues. The collaborative process had created something larger and more complex than Maria's original guerrilla art, incorporating input from established artists and community members while maintaining the flowing aesthetic that had characterized her unauthorized work. The progression from crime scene photographs to documentation of positive community outcome illustrated the transformative potential of restorative justice approaches that addressed underlying motivations rather than simply punishing criminal behavior. The images told a story of creative energy redirected rather than suppressed, of individual talent channeled into community benefit. The missing person file for Eleanor Hoffman contained photographs that documented Detective Reynolds' methodical search for the elderly woman who had disappeared while traveling to reconcile with her estranged brother. The images showed Mrs. Hoffman's apartment exactly as she had left it, with her suitcase missing from the bedroom closet, but everything else precisely arranged according to the careful habits of a lifetime. Detective Reynolds had photographed the letters from Robert Hoffman that had provided the crucial clue to his sister's intended destination. Documents that revealed a correspondence spanning several months as two elderly siblings had worked to overcome decades of separation and hurt feelings. The handwriting in the letters showed the trembling script of age, but the words conveyed genuine affection and a shared understanding that time was running short for healing old wounds. The hospital photographs from Denver, where Mrs. Hoffman had been found after her stroke, showed a small, confused woman in an institutional bed, surrounded by medical equipment, but safe and receiving appropriate care. The images captured both her vulnerability and her dignity, showing how medical professionals had maintained her comfort and privacy while working to identify her and locate her family. Final photograph in the file showed Mrs. Hoffman's successful reunion with her Brother in Portland. An image that Detective Reynolds had received several months after closing the case. The picture showed two elderly people embracing in what appeared to be a modest living room, their faces showing the relief and joy of reconciliation. Accomplished before it was too late. The hit and run investigation that had claimed the life of Robert Kowalski was documented through photographs that captured both the tragic scene of the accident and the community response that had followed. Detective Davis had taken careful images of the location on Elm Street where Mr. Kowalski had been struck, showing the quiet residential character that had made the incident so shocking to neighbors who had known the victim for decades. The scene photographs showed Mr. Kowalski's dog, Buddy, sitting patiently beside the spot where his owner had fallen, an image that had become symbolic of the loyalty and loss that the accident had created. The dog's patient vigil had continued until neighbors had taken him home, but his unwillingness to leave the scene had spoken to the deep bonds that connected him to his daily walking routine with Mr. Kowalski. Later photographs documented the memorial garden that neighbors had created in the small park where Mr. Kowalski had often walked with Buddy, showing how the community had transformed grief into a lasting tribute that would serve future generations of residents. The garden included a small plaque with Mr. Kowalski's name and dates, surrounded by flowering plants that would bloom each year in his memory. The images also captured the improved street lighting and safety measures that had been installed following Mr. Kowalski's death, showing how tragedy had motivated practical changes that would protect other pedestrians. The photographs documented not just the immediate impact of the crime, but the community's determination to prevent similar incidents through advocacy and action. The anonymous letters case that Detective Kim had investigated was documented through careful photographs of each message, showing the typed text that had exposed municipal corruption while maintaining the mystery of their authorship. The images revealed the plain paper and standard typewriter font that had made the letters difficult to trace, but also captured the careful organization and detailed knowledge that had made them so effective in exposing wrongdoing. Detective Kim had also photographed the government documents and records that had confirmed many of the allegations contained in the anonymous letters, creating a visual record of the corruption that had been exposed through the mysterious correspondence. The images showed contracts, meeting minutes, and financial records that revealed the improper relationships between city officials and construction companies. The final photographs, in this case, showed the public meetings and hearings that had followed the exposure of corruption, images that captured citizens exercising their democratic rights to demand accountability from their elected officials. The pictures documented the positive outcomes that had resulted from the anonymous letter writer's decision to expose wrongdoing. Regardless of the personal risks involved, the rare book theft from the university library was documented through photographs that showed both the crime scene and the scholarly materials that had been stolen. Detective Martinez had taken careful images of the empty shelves in the special collections area, showing the precise spaces where valuable manuscripts and first editions had once rested in climate-controlled security. The photographs of the stolen books, taken from library catalog records, revealed the historical and monetary value of the materials that had been taken, showing illuminated manuscripts, author signatures, and binding details that made each volume unique and irreplaceable. The images conveyed not just the financial loss but the cultural damage that had been inflicted on the university's research resources. Detective Martinez had also documented the security measures that had been improved following the theft, showing the enhanced access controls and monitoring systems that had been installed to prevent similar incidents. The photographs captured both the vulnerability that had been exploited and the determination to protect scholarly materials for future generations of researchers. The case files from the 1990s showed the beginning of digital photography's integration into police documentation, with some images printed from electronic files rather than captured on traditional film. The transition created interesting contrasts between the grain and warmth of analog photography and the crisp precision of early digital images, marking a technological shift that would eventually transform law enforcement documentation. Detective Johnson's photographs of the shoplifting case involving Mrs. Patricia Wong showed the careful documentation of evidence that had revealed the desperate circumstances behind her theft of food items. The images captured the small quantities and basic nature of the stolen goods, telling a story of need rather than greed that had motivated Detective Johnson's compassionate response to the elderly woman's situation. The photographs also documented Mrs. Wong's apartment, showing the sparse conditions that had led to her shoplifting, while also revealing the dignity and care she had maintained despite her financial difficulties. The images captured personal belongings and family, photographs that told the story of a life that had once been prosperous, but had been reduced to desperation by circumstances beyond her control. Later photographs showed Mrs. Wong's involvement with the food bank that had helped her during her crisis, images that captured her transformation from client to volunteer as she used her own experience to help other elderly people navigate the social services system. The pictures documented not just individual recovery, but community resilience and mutual support. The domestic disturbance cases from Officer Chun's files were illustrated with photographs that captured family stress without violating privacy, showing general neighborhood conditions and housing situations that provided context for understanding the pressures that created conflicts. The images revealed overcrowded live-in conditions, economic challenges, and environmental factors that contributed to family tensions. Officer Chun had also documented the community resources and support services that had been mobilized to help families in crisis, photographing the facilities and programs that provided alternatives to purely punitive responses to domestic conflicts. The images showed counseling centers, job training programs, and community mediation services that addressed underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms. The photographs from the noise complaint mediation at Riverside Apartments captured the community meeting that Officer Martinez had organized to address conflicts between neighbors with different lifestyles and schedules. The images showed residents of different ages and backgrounds sitting together around tables, engaged in the kind of direct communication that had transformed complaints into understanding. The success of this community-based approach was documented in later photographs that showed neighbors socializing together during building events and working cooperatively on shared maintenance projects. The images captured the transformation of an apartment complex from a collection of isolated individuals into a genuine community where people looked out for each other's welfare. The cold case photographs held a different quality, a sense of unresolved mystery that time had not diminished. The images of Marcus Webb's office and apartment captured a life suspended in time, showing personal belongings and work materials that had waited patiently for an owner who had never returned to claim them. The photographs preserved the exact moment when ordinary life had been interrupted by inexplicable disappearance. The book burglary case was illustrated with images of the empty shelves where personal libraries had once rested, showing the precise absence that had characterized these unusual crimes. The photographs of the recovered books in medical clinic waiting rooms captured the accidental public service that had resulted from the thefts, transforming private collections into community resources. Sarah found herself particularly moved by the photographs that documented the human impact of crimes rather than just their technical details. Images of victims' faces, witnesses' expressions, and family members' reactions captured the emotional reality that official reports necessarily reduced to factual language. These pictures preserve the full human dimension of law enforcement work, The way police officers serve not just as investigators, but as witnesses to the complete spectrum of human experience. The evidence room also contained photographs from crime scenes that had never been publicized. Images that captured moments of tragedy, conflict, and resolution that remain known only to law enforcement personnel and the people directly involved. These pictures represented the private side of police work, the countless incidents that were resolved quietly without attracting media attention or public notice. Detective Morrison's photographs of neighborhood watch meetings showed ordinary citizens taking responsibility for their community's safety, gathering in living rooms and community centers to share information and coordinate informal surveillance that supplemented official law enforcement efforts. The images captured the democratic participation that formed the foundation of effective community policing. The progression of photographs over decades revealed changes in both technology and approach, showing how police work had evolved while maintaining its essential focus on protecting community safety and seeking justice for victims of crime. Early black and white images gave way to color photography, which eventually included digital formats that allowed for enhanced analysis and wider distribution. Yet regardless of technological changes, the fundamental purpose of police photography remained constant: to capture truth, preserve evidence, and document the careful work of investigation that transformed chaos into understanding. The photographs served as visual testimony to the patience, skill, and dedication that characterized effective law enforcement at its best. In the quiet archive where these images rested, Sarah could sense the weight of all the stories they contained, the lives they had touched, the investigations they had supported, and the justice they had helped achieve. Each photograph was a moment frozen in time, but together they created a continuous narrative of community life and the ongoing effort to maintain safety, order, and human dignity through the patient application of law and compassion. The faded photographs held their subjects with gentle dignity, preserving not just evidence but memory, not just facts but the full human context that gave those facts meaning. In the dim light of the evidence room, these images continued their patient vigil, ready to serve truth and justice whenever they might be needed, holding light captured long ago in the quiet spaces between memory and evidence, where time transformed shock into peace and urgency into the timeless patience of preserved truth. Sarah Chun walked slowly along 5th Street in the early evening, when the day shift had ended and the night shift had not yet begun, when the city existed in that liminal space between its daytime and nighttime identities. The streetlights had not yet activated, but the sun hung low enough that buildings cast long shadows across the pavement, creating geometric patterns that changed subtly as she moved through the downtown district, where so many of the archived cases had unfolded. The building that had once housed Consolidated Financial Services still stood at the corner of 5th and Commercial, though it now contained a collection of small businesses and professional offices that served the neighborhood's evolved needs. The limestone facade showed the weathering of decades, but the architectural details remained sharp enough to speak of the era when the building had represented the solid prosperity of mid-century American commerce. This was where Marcus Webb had worked for 8 years, before walking out one Tuesday afternoon in March of 1992 and disappearing completely from all available records. Sarah paused in front of the building's main entrance, trying to imagine the routine that had carried Marcus through these doors every weekday morning for nearly a decade. The familiar rhythm that had been broken by whatever decision or circumstance had led him to leave his wallet and keys in his desk drawer and walk away from his entire documented life. The street itself held no obvious signs of the mystery that had unfolded here 33 years earlier, but Sarah found herself sensitive to the layered history that existed beneath the current surface of ordinary urban life. Somewhere in the accumulated memory of sidewalks and storefronts, the echo of Marcus Webb's final walk to the bank still resonated. preserved in the city's vast archive of human movement and decision. The bank he had supposedly been visiting was 3 blocks north. Its original building now converted to a restaurant that specialized in locally sourced ingredients and artisanal preparations. The transformation seemed fitting somehow, turning a place dedicated to the storage and exchange of money into a space where people gathered to nourish themselves and each other. The building's solid construction had made it suitable for both purposes. Its high ceilings and large windows, creating an atmosphere of openness and permanence that served different functions across different eras. Sarah walked the route that Marcus might have taken, following the sidewalk pattern that would have been natural for someone making a quick trip from office to bank during a busy Tuesday afternoon. The path led through the heart of the downtown district, past other buildings that had housed the businesses and institutions that formed the infrastructure of community life during the early 1990s. The Morrison Department store building still dominated the middle of the commercial block, though it now contained a mix of retail shops, service businesses, and professional offices that reflected the changed economy of the downtown area. This was where the teenage dress theft had occurred. The incident that Officer Kim had resolved through collaboration between law enforcement, store management, and local charities to address both the legal violation and the underlying need that had motivated it. Sarah could imagine the teenage girl standing before the formal dresses, feeling the weight of social expectations and economic limitations that had made theft seem like the only solution to her need for appropriate clothing for her school's formal dance. The store's transformation into multiple smaller businesses seemed to reflect broader changes in how communities met their members' needs. With less concentration of resources in single large institutions and more distribution through networks of smaller, specialized providers, the apartment building where Mrs. Patricia Wong had lived during her shoplifting crisis still housed elderly residents on fixed incomes, though the surrounding neighborhood had experienced enough economic development to provide better access to social services and community support. The small grocery store, where her theft had been discovered, had evolved into a community market that partnered with local food banks to ensure that no one in the neighborhood went hungry due to economic circumstances. Detective Johnson's compassionate response to Mrs. Wong's situation had helped establish protocols that were still being used to address similar cases, connecting people in crisis with appropriate resources rather than simply processing them through the criminal justice system. The building itself seemed to embody this evolution, its solid construction providing stable housing, while its community context had developed the social infrastructure necessary to support residents through difficult periods. Sarah walked through the Riverside district, where so many of the neighborhood-level cases had unfolded, observing how the area had matured while maintaining the character that made it attractive to families seeking stable community life. The streets showed the accumulation of careful maintenance and gradual improvement that characterized neighborhoods where residents felt invested in long-term community welfare. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman's house at 247 Maple Street was now occupied by a young family with small children, but the garden that she had tended for 4 decades continued to flourish under their care. The new residents had maintained the established plantings while adding their own touches, creating a landscape that honored the past while serving current needs. The house itself seemed to radiate the stability and care that had characterized Mrs. Hoffman's decades of residence, as though the building itself had absorbed and preserved the qualities that had made her such a valued neighbor. The vacant lot where Harold Morrison had once demonstrated his confused nighttime yard work had been converted into a small neighborhood park with playground, equipment, and picnic tables that served families throughout the district. The transformation seemed to honor Mr. Morrison's desire to maintain community standards while channeling that energy into something that benefited current residents. The park included a memorial bench with his name, recognizing his long residence in the neighborhood and his contribution to its character. The house where the Chun family had built their restaurant business still operated as a community gathering place, though it had evolved from a family-owned restaurant into a community center that hosted cultural events, language classes, and neighborhood meetings. The building's transformation reflected the family's successful integration into the community and their ongoing contribution to the neighborhood's social and cultural life. The success of the Chun family's integration had influenced the broader character of the Riverside district, which had become known for its welcoming attitude toward new residents from diverse backgrounds. The neighborhood had developed a reputation for helping newcomers navigate the practical challenges of establishing themselves in the community while maintaining the social cohesion that made it attractive to long-term residents. Sarah walked past the apartment complex where Officer Martinez had mediated the noise complaints that had evolved into a model for community-based conflict resolution. The building now included common areas and social activities that had grown out of the residents' meeting that had addressed the original conflicts. The success of that mediation had influenced apartment management practices throughout the city, demonstrating how proactive community building could prevent problems more effectively than reactive enforcement of regulations. Downtown area where Maria Santos had created her unauthorized urban art still showed traces of her influence, though her original work had long since been painted over or weathered away. The community center mural that had grown out of her arrest remained vibrant and well-maintained, serving as both a work of art and a symbol of the neighborhood's commitment to channeling creative energy into constructive community expression. The success of Maria's transition from guerrilla artist to community collaborator had influenced the city's approach to public art and youth engagement, leading to programs that provided legal opportunities for artistic expression while maintaining respect for property rights and community standards. Several other murals throughout the downtown area reflected this evolved approach, showing how individual creativity could serve broader community goals. Roosevelt High School, where Sarah Morrison had expressed her frustrations through vandalism, had developed student government and advocacy programs that provided constructive channels for young people to influence school policies and procedures. The building itself had been renovated to include spaces designed specifically for student organization and expression, acknowledging the legitimate desire of young people to have voice in the institutions that shaped their daily lives. The success of these programs had influenced educational approaches throughout the school district, with increased emphasis on student participation in school governance and policy development. Sarah Morrison's case had helped demonstrate that teenage misbehavior often reflected genuine concerns that could be addressed through appropriate channels if those channels were made available and accessible. The courthouse, where so many of these cases had found their legal resolution, continued to serve the community's need for fair and impartial justice. Though it had been renovated to improve accessibility and to provide better support for victims, witnesses, and families involved in legal proceedings, the building's architectural dignity remained intact, but its interior had been modified to reflect evolved understanding of how physical spaces could support the human needs that were central to effective justice. Judge Harrison's chambers had been converted into a mediation center where many disputes were now resolved through collaborative problem-solving rather than adversarial litigation. The success of his creative sentencing approaches had influenced judicial practices throughout the region, demonstrating how legal proceedings could address underlying causes of criminal behavior rather than simply imposing punishment for its effects. The police station itself had undergone renovations that reflected lessons learned from decades of community policing experience. The building now included community meeting rooms, victim services offices, and public access areas that made law enforcement more accessible to residents who needed assistance or wanted to participate in crime prevention efforts. The archive areas where Sarah had spent so many hours exploring old case files had been expanded and modernized while maintaining the careful organization and preservation standards that made them valuable resources for ongoing police work. The basement corridors still extended through seemingly endless rows of filing cabinets, but they now included digital storage systems that made information more accessible while preserving the original documents that carried the full texture of historical investigations. Detective Williams's active documentation unit had evolved into a comprehensive records management system that supported both current investigations and historical research, ensuring that lessons learned from past cases could inform current police work. The careful attention to detail and context that had characterized Williams's approach to transforming field reports into official documentation continued to influence department standards for accuracy and completeness. The community policing philosophy that had characterized so much of the work documented in the archives had become integrated into all aspects of the department's operations, from patrol procedures to detective work to administrative policies. Officers continued to receive training in conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity, and community engagement that prepared them to address problems in their full social context, rather than simply responding to their immediate legal aspects. The intersection of 5th Street and Commercial Avenue, where the morning rush hour accident had required Officer Rodriguez's careful documentation and investigation, now included improved traffic signals and pedestrian safety measures that reflected ongoing attention to community safety needs. The intersection had become a model for urban traffic management that balanced the needs of vehicle traffic with pedestrian safety and neighborhood livability. The success of Officer Rodriguez's comprehensive approach to accident investigation had influenced traffic safety practices throughout the city, leading to systematic reviews of intersection design and signal timing that prevented accidents rather than simply responding to them after they occurred. The intersection now included features that made it safer for elderly pedestrians like Mr. Kowalski, honoring his memory through practical improvements that protected others. The West Side neighborhood where the book burglaries had occurred had developed a network of informal libraries and book-sharing programs that reflected the community's appreciation for literature and learning. The resolution of the book burglary case had helped residents understand that the theft had been motivated by illness rather than malice, leading to increased support for elderly residents who might be experiencing cognitive decline or other health challenges. The medical clinics and community centers where some of the stolen books had been donated continued to provide reading materials for people seeking healthcare and social services, maintaining the accidental public benefit that had resulted from the crimes. The success of this informal book distribution had influenced the development of more systematic programs for providing reading materials to underserved populations. The university library, where the rare book theft had occurred, had become a model for institutional security that balanced protection of valuable materials with accessibility for legitimate research. The improvements implemented after Detective Martinez's investigation had influenced security practices at cultural institutions throughout the region, demonstrating how careful assessment of vulnerabilities could prevent crime without creating barriers to educational and cultural access. **. The empty building where Harold Vance had sought shelter during his period of homelessness had been converted into transitional housing that provided temporary accommodation for people working to establish stable living situations. Officer Thompson's compassionate approach to Harold's trespassing case had influenced the development of housing policies that addressed homelessness through service provision rather than purely punitive responses. The success of Harold's transition from homelessness to stable housing and employment had provided a model for addressing similar situations, demonstrating how collaboration between law enforcement, social services, and community organizations could address underlying problems rather than simply treating their symptoms. The building now served multiple individuals each year who were working to rebuild their lives after periods of housing instability. Asterisk. As Sarah walked through these neighborhoods in the gathering dusk, she could sense the accumulated wisdom that had grown out of decades of careful police work and community engagement. Each building, each street corner, each intersection held the memory of problems addressed and solutions found through the patient application of professional skill, guided by genuine concern for community welfare. The city had become an archive of successful collaboration between law enforcement and residents, a living demonstration of how problems could be solved through understanding rather than force, through community engagement rather than isolation, through attention to underlying causes rather than simple reaction to immediate symptoms. The streetlights began to activate as full darkness approached, creating pools of warm illumination that welcomed the night shift officers who would continue the ongoing work of protecting community safety and seeking justice for victims of crime. The transition from day to night brought its own rhythm and its own opportunities for the careful work that formed the foundation of effective policing. In the quiet spaces between buildings, in the gentle transitions between neighborhoods, in the accumulated wisdom of streets that had witnessed decades of human experience, the city itself had become an archive where every corner held whispered stories and every building remembered what time had chosen to preserve. The physical infrastructure of community life carried within it the memory of all the careful work that had been done to maintain safety, order, and human dignity through the patient application of law and compassion. The city slept peacefully, watched over by officers who understood that their work was not just about enforcing laws, but about maintaining the delicate balance that made community life possible. In the accumulated memory of streets and buildings, the echo of every resolved case continued to resonate, contributing to the ongoing story of a community's effort to create justice and safety through cooperation, understanding, and mutual care. The archive basement had grown, quiet in a way that felt different from the usual institutional silence that characterized after-hours buildings. Detective Sarah Chun walked slowly through the corridors she had come to know so well, past the filing cabinets that held decades of careful documentation, feeling the weight of completion that comes when long exploration reaches its natural conclusion. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, but somehow the sound seemed softer now, more like a lullaby than the mechanical drone she had first noticed months ago. In Section Z, the newest area of the archive, she found the final reports that had brought closure to many of the cases she had followed through their original investigations and subsequent developments. These files represented the endpoints of stories that had begun in crisis and confusion, but had eventually found their way to resolution, understanding, or at least the peaceful acceptance that some questions might never find complete answers. The Marcus Webb file had grown thick with supplementary reports documenting the ongoing search that had continued long after Detective Reynolds had officially closed the case. Family members had never stopped hoping for information about what had happened to the quiet accountant who had walked away from his orderly life on that Tuesday afternoon in 1992. After 33 years of periodic reviews and follow-up investigations, The case had been formally transferred to the permanently inactive files, where it would rest with the understanding that some mysteries belonged to the category of human experience that resisted complete explanation. The final report, written by Detective Morrison's successor in the Cold Case Unit, acknowledged that Marcus Webb's disappearance might represent the ultimate expression of personal autonomy, a decision to step away from documented existence that was both profound and private. The investigation had explored every possible explanation for his vanishing, but sometimes the absence of evidence was itself a kind of evidence, suggesting that some people possessed the determination and skill necessary to disappear completely when remaining had become unbearable. The file now rested in its designated place with a kind of dignity that honored both the thoroughness of the investigation and the mystery that had motivated it. Marcus Webb had found his own form of peace, whatever that might have been, and his case had found its peace in the acceptance that not all questions could be answered. Not all stories could be completed with the satisfaction of definitive resolution. The book burglary case had reached a very different kind of conclusion when Professor Edward Chun, retired from the university's English department, had contacted the police to confess his responsibility for the thefts that had puzzled Detective Rodriguez more than 35 years earlier. Professor Chun's early-stage dementia had progressed to the point where he could no longer maintain the secret that had burdened him throughout his retirement, and his family had helped him contact authorities to make peace with his past actions. The confession had revealed that Professor Chun's book stealing had been motivated by a compulsive disorder that had been triggered by his retirement, anxiety, and his fear of losing access to the academic resources that had defined his professional identity. He had taken books from neighbors' houses because he had been unable to bear the thought of being separated from literature, even though he already owned extensive libraries and had legitimate access to university collections. The resolution had been handled with the same compassion that had characterized the original investigation, recognizing that Professor Chun's confession was motivated by genuine remorse and his desire to make amends for actions that had violated his own values as much as they had harmed his neighbors. The books had long since been redistributed throughout the community, serving readers in medical clinics, community centers, and informal lending libraries that had grown out of the original thefts. The final report noted that Professor Chun had spent his remaining lucid years volunteering with literacy programs and book distribution efforts, channeling his love of literature into service that benefited others rather than compulsive collection that served only his own psychological needs. His confession had brought closure not only to the case, but to his own struggle with actions that had troubled him for decades. Hit-and-run case that had claimed Robert Kowalski's life had reached resolution through an unexpected phone call that had come to the police department 15 years after the original investigation. The caller, Margaret Foster, had been the driver who had struck Mr. Kowalski during a moment of inattention while driving home from work on that October evening in 1994. Mrs. Foster's call had been prompted by her own terminal illness and her desire to confess before her death to actions that had haunted her conscience for more than a decade. She had left the scene of the accident in panic and confusion, but had been aware that she had struck someone and had lived with guilt and fear throughout the years when Detective Davis had been conducting his thorough investigation. The confession had provided the closure that Mr. Kowalski's neighbors had sought for so many years, but it had also revealed the human complexity that characterized even tragic crimes. Mrs. Foster had been a responsible citizen with no previous criminal record who had made a terrible decision in a moment of shock and fear. Her subsequent years had been shadowed by remorse and anxiety that had affected her health and her relationships with family and friends. Asterisk. The resolution had been handled through the district attorney's office with attention to both justice and mercy, recognizing that criminal punishment might be less important than the opportunity for atonement and healing. Mrs. Foster had worked with Mr. Kowalski's family to establish a scholarship fund in his memory and had spent her remaining time volunteering with pedestrian safety organizations that work to prevent similar accidents. The case had been formally closed with the understanding that justice sometimes required more than legal prosecution, that healing sometimes demanded acknowledgement and restitution rather than punishment. Mrs. Foster's confession had brought peace to Mr. Kowalski's memory and to her own conscience, completing a circle of responsibility and forgiveness that honored the complexity of human moral experience. The anonymous letters case had found an unexpected conclusion when the city's former planning director, James Morrison, had included a confession in his personal papers that had been discovered after his death from natural causes. Mr. Morrison had written the letters exposing municipal corruption because he had been unable to participate in the illegal activities that some of his colleagues had been engaged in, but had also been afraid to report the problems through official channels that might have cost him his career and pension. His confession had explained the detailed knowledge and careful documentation that had characterized the anonymous letters, revealing that they had been written by someone who had witnessed the corruption firsthand, but had felt trapped by economic and professional pressures that made official whistleblowing seem impossible. Mr. Morrison had chosen anonymity as a way to expose wrongdoing while protecting his family's financial security. The final report on the case had noted that Mr. Morrison's letters had accomplished their intended purpose of exposing corruption and reforming municipal contracting procedures, demonstrating that sometimes justice could be served through unconventional means when traditional channels seemed inadequate or dangerous. His confession had provided closure for Detective Kim's investigation, while honoring the civic courage that had motivated his decision to risk legal consequences in service of public integrity. The rare book theft from the university library had been solved through advances in digital investigation, techniques that had allowed Detective Martinez's successor to trace some of the stolen materials to online auctions and private collectors. The recovery effort had taken more than a decade, but eventually most of the valuable manuscripts and first editions had been returned to the university's special collections. The case had been formally closed with the arrest and prosecution of Dr. William Hayes, a private collector who had purchased the stolen books through intermediaries and had attempted to legitimize his ownership through fraudulent documentation. Dr. Hayes had been motivated by obsessive collecting rather than financial gain, seeking to possess rare materials that he could not have acquired through legal means. The resolution had led to improvements in how cultural institutions tracked and protect valuable materials, while also creating better cooperation between law enforcement agencies and the scholarly community in addressing crimes against cultural heritage. The case had demonstrated that patience and persistence could overcome even sophisticated attempts to hide stolen cultural property. Tommy Morrison, the teenager whose Woodland Fort burglaries had been resolved with such care by Detective Williams, had grown up to become a social worker specializing in juvenile justice programs. His experience with restorative approaches to teenage crime had influenced his career choice and had made him an effective advocate for young people who found themselves in similar situations. The final report on Tommy's case included updates on his adult life and career, showing how thoughtful intervention during adolescence could influence an entire life trajectory in positive directions. Tommy had become a mentor for other young people who were struggling with behavioral problems, using his own experience to demonstrate that mistakes did not have to define future possibilities. Maria Santos, the urban artist whose spray painting had led to community mural programs, had become a nationally recognized public artist whose work brought communities together through collaborative creative projects. Her arrest and the creative sentencing that had followed had changed not only her own life, but had influenced approaches to youth engagement and public art throughout the region. The case file included photographs of murals that Maria had created in dozens of communities, showing how individual talent, guided by community support, could create lasting beauty and social connection. Her transformation from unauthorized tagger to respected community artist had demonstrated the potential for restorative justice approaches that addressed underlying creativity and social needs rather than simply punishing rule-breaking behavior. David Morrison, whose drug dealing had been addressed through community service and counseling rather than purely punitive measures, had completed college and become a substance abuse counselor working with teenagers who were facing similar challenges. His experience with law enforcement that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment had influenced his career choice and made him effective in helping other young people avoid the mistakes he had made. The Case Closure Report documented David's ongoing contributions to drug prevention and treatment programs, showing how his teenage mistake had been transformed into lifelong service that prevented similar problems for others. His story illustrated how thoughtful criminal justice responses could create positive outcomes that extended far beyond individual cases. Sarah Morrison, the high school student whose vandalism had expressed legitimate concerns about educational policies, had become a lawyer specializing in educational advocacy and student rights. Her experience with creative sentencing that channeled her political energy into constructive activism had influenced her career path and made her effective in helping other young people find legal ways to influence institutional policies. The final report included information about Sarah's work with school districts throughout the state, helping to develop policies that gave students meaningful voice in educational decisions while maintaining appropriate respect for institutional authority. Her case had demonstrated that teenage misbehavior sometimes reflected genuine civic engagement that could be guided into productive channels. Mrs. Patricia Wong, whose shoplifting had revealed the economic struggles of elderly residents, had become a volunteer coordinator for senior services programs that prevented others from experiencing the desperation that had led to her theft. Her transformation from crime victim to community resource had illustrated the potential for individual crises to motivate systemic improvements in social support. The case closure documented Mrs. Wong's ongoing work with food banks and senior advocacy organizations, showing how her experience with compassionate law enforcement had enabled her to help others navigate economic challenges without resorting to illegal activities. Her story demonstrated the ripple effects of thoughtful police work that addressed underlying needs, rather than simply treating criminal symptoms. The Chun family's restaurant had evolved into a community cultural center that provided programming for immigrants and refugees throughout the region. Their experience with both hate crimes and random violence had motivated their commitment to building bridges between different communities while advocating for policies that protected vulnerable populations from discrimination and exploitation. The final reports documented the family's ongoing contributions to community integration and cultural understanding, showing how their resilience in facing criminal victimization had strengthened rather than weakened their commitment to their adopted community. Their story illustrated how effective police response to hate crimes could support rather than discourage immigrant participation in American civic life. Harold Vance, the homeless veteran whose trespassing had been resolved through connection with appropriate services, had not only found stable housing and employment, but had become an advocate for homeless veterans throughout the region. His experience with Officer Thompson's compassionate approach to his trespass case had influenced his understanding of how law enforcement could serve rather than criminalize people experiencing housing instability. The case closure included documentation of Harold's work with veterans organizations and homeless services providers, showing how his own successful transition had enabled him to help others navigate similar challenges. His story demonstrated the long-term community benefits that could result from police work that addressed underlying problems rather than simply enforcing laws. In the quiet of the archive basement, Sarah found herself surrounded by the completed stories of human beings who had intersected with law enforcement during moments of crisis, conflict, or confusion, but who had been treated with dignity and patience that had enabled them to grow beyond their mistakes and contribute positively to their communities. The files represented more than just closed cases. They documented a philosophy of policing that recognized the potential for redemption and positive change that existed within every human situation. The archive itself had become a testament to the possibility of justice that served healing rather than simply punishment. Law enforcement that built community rather than simply maintaining order. And criminal justice that recognized the full humanity of everyone it touched. The careful documentation preserved not only the facts of investigations, but the wisdom that had been gained through decades of thoughtful police work. Detective Williams, who had spent his career transforming field reports into official documentation, had retired to a position training new officers in the importance of careful investigation and thorough record-keeping. His influence continued through the generations of police officers who had learned from his example that documentation was not just bureaucratic requirement, but essential foundation for justice and community safety. Officer Kim, Officer Rodriguez, Officer Martinez, and dozens of other dedicated law enforcement professionals had continued throughout their careers to apply the patient, thoughtful approaches that had characterized their early cases. Their accumulated wisdom had influenced department policies and training programs that prepared new officers to serve their communities with the same combination of professional skill and human compassion. Detective Morrison, Detective Davis, Detective Johnson, and other investigators, whose cases had been documented in the archives, had established standards for thorough investigation and creative problem-solving that continued to influence police work throughout the region. Their understanding that effective law enforcement required attention to social context and underlying causes had become integrated into department culture and community expectations. The community members whose lives had intersected with these cases had continued to contribute to the ongoing work of maintaining neighborhood safety and social cohesion. Mrs. Hoffman's vigilant attention to community welfare, the Chun family's commitment to cultural bridge building, the Morrison family's dedication to youth development, and dozens of other examples of civic engagement had created networks of mutual support that made formal law enforcement more effective and less necessary. The archives themselves had become a resource for ongoing police training and community education, providing examples of effective approaches to common problems and demonstrating the positive outcomes that were possible when law enforcement was practiced with patience, creativity, and genuine concern for community welfare. The careful preservation of these records ensured that future generations of officers and citizens could learn from the wisdom that had been accumulated through decades of thoughtful police work. In the final silence of closed files, Sarah could sense the peace that came from stories completed, problems resolved, and wisdom preserved for future use. The archives held not only the record of past investigations, but the foundation for future police work that would continue to serve community safety through the careful application of professional skill guided by human understanding and compassion. The basement corridors stretched into darkness beyond the reach of her vision, but she knew that they continued to hold thousands of other stories, other investigations, Other examples of human complexity addressed through patient law enforcement. The archive would continue to grow as new cases were investigated and resolved. But the foundation had been established for police work that served healing rather than simply punishment. Community building rather than simple law enforcement. The fluorescent lights continued their gentle humming, creating a lullaby for the sleeping cases that had found their rest in careful documentation and peaceful resolution. In the accumulated silence of completed investigations, peace settled like dust on stories that had found their place in the endless archive of human experience, where every case, whether solved or forever mysterious, contributed to the ongoing effort to maintain justice and safety through patience, understanding, and hope. The city above slept peacefully, protected by officers who had learned from the wisdom preserved in these archives, guided by the understanding that their work was not just about enforcing laws, but about serving the complex needs of human communities seeking safety, justice, and the possibility of redemption for everyone who had lost their way. In the gentle darkness of the archive basement, the stories rested in perfect silence, complete at last in their documentation of the endless human effort to create peace through patient attention to truth, justice, and the fundamental dignity that belonged to every person whose story had found its way into the careful preservation of memory.